I was on my way home after a long drive through the countryside. Snow had been falling heavily all day, and the world outside my windshield was a blur of white. The road stretched on time-lapse, endlessly, empty and silent, except for the crunch of my tires on the frozen ground. It was peaceful at first, but as the sun dipped below the horizon, peace turned into something else, something that felt wrong, the kind of wrong you feel deep in your chest. The storm grew fiercer as darkness settled in. My headlights illuminated the snowflakes swirling in the air like ghosts, and my fingers gripped the wheel tighter. There were no houses, no signs of life, just endless, white emptiness. I was completely alone, or so I thought. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something on the side of the road. At first, I thought it was a shadow cast by the trees, but as I drew closer, I realized it was a person. They were sitting on the ground, hunched over, covered in frost and snow. My foot hesitated over the brake pedal. The logical part of me screamed to keep driving, to ignore whatever I'd seen. But another part, the part that couldn't leave someone to freeze to death, made me pull over. I left the car running as I stepped out into the cold. The wind hit me like a slap, biting through my jacket and stinging my face. The snow crunched under my boots as I approached the figure. They didn't move, didn't even seem to notice me. "Hey," I called out, my voice nearly lost in the howling wind. "Are you okay?" No response. I crouched down beside them, my breath visible in the freezing air. They were wearing a thin fur coat, completely inadequate for the weather. Their face was pale, lips blue, and their eyes were closed. I reached out, hesitating for a moment, before shaking their shoulder gently. Their eyes snapped open. I stumbled back, nearly falling into the snow. Those eyes, there was something wrong with them. They were milky white, as if frozen over, and yet they stared straight at me, unblinking. The person didn't speak, didn't move. They just stared. My instinct screamed at me to run, but instead, I forced myself to speak again. "Can you hear me? Are you hurt?" Slowly, their mouth opened. At first, I thought they were going to, but no words came out. Instead, a strange sound escaped their lips, a low, guttural hum that made my skin crawl. It wasn't the sound of a human voice. It was something else entirely. The wind seemed to die for a moment, as if the world was holding its breath. Then, without warning, the figure started to stand. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on strings. I backed away, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I'll call for help," I stammered, retreating toward my car. "Just stay here." But they didn't stay. They took a step toward me, their frozen limb like ice cracking on a lake. I turned and ran, slipping on the snow as I scrambled back into my car. My hands shook as I slammed the door shut and locked it. Through the windshield, I could see them standing in the glow of my headlights. They were closer now, their head tilted at an unnatural angle. Those frozen eyes never left me. I threw the car into gear and hit the gas. The tires spun for a moment before catching, and the car lurched forward. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The figure was still standing, there, motionless, watching me. The road stretched on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. Every shadow seemed to move. Every gust of wind sounded like whispers. I kept looking in the mirror, half expecting to see those milky eyes staring back at me. And then I did. The figure was sitting in my back seat. My scream echoed in the confined space of the car as I swerved wildly, nearly sliding off the road. When I turned around to look, the seat was empty. My breath came in shallow gasps as I struggled to stay in control. I couldn't tell if I was losing my mind, if something far worse was happening. The snow grew heavier, the world outside the car disappearing into a white void. I was driving blind, my only guide the narrow strip of road in front of me. The air inside the car felt colder, now, so cold I could see my breath. Then the radio crackled to life. It was a soft, static-filled hum at first, but then I heard it the same guttural sound the figure had made. It filled the car, growing louder and louder, until it was all I could hear. I reached for the knob, desperate to turn it off. But no matter how much I twisted and pressed, the sound wouldn't stop, and then the car died. The engine sputtered once, twice, and then fell silent. The headlights flickered and went out, leaving me in complete darkness. My heart raced as I fumbled for my phone, but when I looked at the screen, it was dead too. That was when I heard it. A faint tapping on the window. It was slow, deliberate, like someone dragging their fingers along the glass. I froze, every muscle in my body locked in terror. The tapping moved, circling the car, as if whatever was outside was deciding the best way in. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare breathe. Then, through the fogged-up glass of the driver's side window, I saw it, a handprint. It pressed against the glass, the frost beneath it, melting slightly from the heater, maybe from something else entirely. I don't remember screaming. I don't remember opening the door or running. The next thing I knew, I was stumbling through the snow, my car left behind in the darkness. I ran blindly, the cold burning my lungs, my feet sinking into the deep snow with every step. When I finally stopped, I was standing in the middle of a frozen field. The storm had eased, and the moon broke through the clouds, illuminating the world in an eerie, silver light. I turned in a slow circle, searching for any sign of the figure. My car, but there was nothing, just snow and silence. And then I heard it, a voice, my voice. It called out from the distance, echoing across the field, "Come back." I stood there, trembling, as the voice grew louder, closer. I knew I should run, but my legs refused to move. The last thing I remember before everything went black was the sound of footsteps crunching in the snow coming straight for me. And then I did. The figure was sitting in my back seat. My scream echoed in the confined space of the car as I swerved wildly, nearly sliding off the road. When I turned around to look, the seat was empty. My breath came in shallow gasps as I struggled to stay in control. I couldn't tell if I was losing my mind, if something far worse was happening. The snow grew heavier, the world outside the car disappearing into a white void. I was driving blind, my only guide the narrow strip of road in front of me. The air inside the car felt colder, now, so cold I could see my breath. Then the radio crackled to life. It was a soft, static-filled hum at first, but then I heard it the same guttural sound the figure had made. It filled the car, growing louder and louder, until it was all I could hear. I reached for the knob, desperate to turn it off, but no matter how much I twisted and pressed, the sound wouldn't stop, and then the car died. The engine sputtered once, twice, and then fell silent. The headlights flickered and went out, leaving me in complete darkness. My heart raced as I fumbled for my phone, but when I looked at the screen, it was dead too. That was when I heard it, a faint tapping on the window. It was slow, deliberate, like someone dragging their fingers along the glass. I froze, every muscle in my body locked in terror. The tapping moved, circling the car, as if whatever was outside was deciding the best way in. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare breathe. Then, through the fogged-up glass of the driver's side window, I saw it, a handprint. It pressed against the glass, the frost beneath it, melting slightly from the heater, maybe from something else entirely. I don't remember screaming. I don't remember opening the door or running. The next thing I knew, I was stumbling through the snow, my car left behind in the darkness. I ran blindly, the cold burning my lungs, my feet sinking into the deep snow with every step. When I finally stopped, I was standing in the middle of a frozen field. The storm had eased, and the moon broke through the clouds, illuminating the world in an eerie, silver light. I turned in a slow circle, searching for any sign of the figure. My car, but there was nothing, just snow and silence. And then I heard it, a voice, my voice. It called out from the distance, echoing across the field, "Come back." I stood there, trembling, as the voice grew louder, closer. I knew I should run, but my legs refused to move. The last thing I remember before everything went black was the sound of footsteps crunching in the snow coming straight for me. The lake was frozen solid, stretching out in all directions like a sheet of pale glass. The world around it was quiet, muffled by the snow that blanketed everything. I had come here for some peace, hoping to clear my mind and enjoy the stillness. The air was bitterly cold, the kind of cold that bites at your skin and fills your breath with frost. Despite the chill, I felt oddly calm as I stepped out onto the ice. The surface was smooth and clear, with cracks spider-webbing beneath my feet. I could see through it in some places, down to the dark, murky water below. It was unnerving, but beautiful, like staring into another world trapped beneath the frozen surface. I walked slowly, my boots crunching on the thin layer of snow dusting the ice. Every step echoed in the silence, and the sound made me feel small, like I didn't belong here. I stopped in the middle of the lake and looked around. The snow-covered trees circled the edges like silent sentinels, and for a moment, I felt truly alone. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light something dark moving under the ice. I blinked and looked again, but it was still there, a shadow. It was faint, blurry, but it was moving. Slowly, it drifted beneath the ice, too large to be a fish, too strange to be my imagination. My stomach tightened as I watched it, trying to convince myself it was nothing. The shadow stopped. I felt my heart skip a beat. It was directly below me now, motionless, as if it were looking up at me through the ice. I couldn't see any features, but I felt its presence, heavy and cold. My breath quickened, fogging up in the freezing air. I told myself to step away, to get off the ice, but my legs wouldn't move. Then it started moving again. It circled beneath me, slow and deliberate, like a predator sizing up its prey. My chest tightened, and I could feel the panic rising. I took a shaky step back, the ice groaning under my weight. The shadow followed, keeping pace with me. No matter which way I moved, it stayed beneath me, as if tethered to my steps. I wanted to run, to get off the lake as fast as I could, but fear held me frozen. The shadow grew, darker, more distinct. It wasn't just a shape anymore, it was something alive. The ice beneath my feet began to crackle. The sound sent a jolt of terror through me. I looked down and saw thin, jagged lines spreading out from where I stood. My weight was too much, or maybe it was the below me. Either way, I needed to get off the ice. I turned and ran, my boots slipping on the slick surface as I headed toward the shore. The shadow followed. It moved faster now, gliding beneath the ice with an unnatural speed. I could hear the cracks spreading with every step I took, the sound growing louder and more frantic. My breaths came in, shallow gasps, visible in the freezing air. The shore felt impossibly far away, and the ice seemed to stretch on forever. I glanced down as I ran, and saw something I will never forget. The shadow wasn't just moving, it was rising. It pressed against the underside of the ice, dark and menacing, as if trying to break through. I could see what looked like fingers, long and thin, clawing at the frozen surface. The ice beneath me gave a deafening crack, and I felt it shift under my weight. Panic surged through me as I ran harder, my boots slipping and sliding. The shore was so close now, just a few more steps. I could feel the ice weakening, hear it splintering beneath me. Then I heard it, a sound like nothing I'd ever heard before. It was a low, guttural moan, deep and resonant, as if the lake itself were groaning in pain. It vibrated through the ice, through my body, making my teeth chatter. I didn't dare look back. I just kept running, praying I would make it to solid ground. Before the ice gave way completely, the moment my boots hit the snow-covered shore, I collapsed, my legs trembling so badly I could hardly stand. I turned to look back at the lake, expecting shadow still lurking beneath the ice, but it was gone. The surface of the lake was still and silent once more, the cracks spreading out like a frozen web. There was no sign of the thing that had been chasing me, no sign that anything was wrong. But I knew what I'd seen. I knew it was real. I sat there in the snow, my breath coming in ragged gasps, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The lake looked so peaceful now, so ordinary, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me, that the thing beneath the ice hadn't gone far. As I got to my feet and started walking away, I felt a strange pull, like something was urging me to look back one last time. Against my better judgment, I turned. There, in the middle of the lake, I saw it. A dark, jagged hole in the ice, as if something had broken through. The shadow was gone, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and ran, leaving the lake and its terrible secret behind. But even now, I can't forget what I saw, can't shake the feeling that it followed me, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to rise again. And every time I pass a frozen lake, I swear I can hear it, the faint sound of something clawing at the ice. The surface of the lake was still and silent once more, the cracks spreading out like a frozen web. There was no sign of the thing that had been chasing me, no sign that anything was wrong. But I knew what I'd seen. I knew it was real. I sat there in the snow, my breath coming in ragged gasps, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The lake looked so peaceful now, so ordinary, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me, that the thing beneath the ice hadn't gone far. As I got to my feet and started walking away, I felt a strange pull, like something was urging me to look back one last time. Against my better judgment, I turned. There, in the middle of the lake, I saw it. A dark, jagged hole in the ice, as if something had broken through. The shadow was gone, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and ran, leaving the lake and its terrible secret behind. But even now, I can't forget what I saw, can't shake the feeling that it followed me, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to rise again. And every time I pass a frozen lake, I swear I can hear it, the faint sound of something clawing at the ice. When I woke up, the room was freezing, not the kind of cold you feel on a chilly winter morning, but a sharp, biting cold that made my breath fog the air in front of me. My blanket, usually warm and comforting, felt stiff against my skin. Groggily, I reached out to turn on the lamp, but when my hand brushed the nightstand, I froze. There was frost covering it. Confused, I sat up, rubbing my arms to fight the icy chill that seemed to cling to me. That's when I noticed the bed. The entire surface was coated in a thin layer of frost, sparkling faintly in the dim light filtering through the window. It was on the blanket, the sheets, and even the pillow, where my head had been resting. I could feel the coldness against my fingertips as I touched it, and a chill ran deeper than the frost itself, a chill of dread. I live alone, and my apartment has always been warm, even during the coldest nights. There was no reason for frost to form inside, let alone on my bed. I tried to come up with explanations. Maybe the heater broke. Maybe a window was left open. But as I scanned the room, everything was closed tight. There were no drafts, no signs of a broken heater. And then I saw the footprints. They were faint, just barely visible against the frost-covered floorboards, but they were there. Tracks leading from the window across the room, stopping right next to my bed. My throat tightened as I stared at them. They were bare footprints, long, thin, and not my own. The window was locked. I checked it over and over, hoping to find some sign that it had been opened, but it hadn't. The glass was frosted over from the inside, little crystals forming strange patterns that seemed almost deliberate, like swirling runes I couldn't read. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was just random frost patterns. I didn't shake the feeling that they were trying to tell me something. I grabbed my phone, desperate to call someone, but the screen wouldn't turn on. Battery had been full when I went to bed, but now it was completely dead, as if the cold had drained the life out of it. My heart pounded as I set it down. Something wasn't right. The air felt heavy, oppressive, like I wasn't alone. I glanced back at the footprints, half expecting to see them leading back toward the window, but they were still there, ending right at my bedside. Whoever or whatever had made them had been standing there, watching me. I couldn't stay in the room. I grabbed a sweater from the chair and bolted for the door, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. But the doorknob was freezing to the touch, so cold it burned my hand when I grabbed it. I yanked my hand back, staring in disbelief as frost spread across the wood, creeping outward like it was alive. The frost moved slowly but deliberately, crawling over the walls and ceiling. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it was coming from the window. The patterns on the glass glowed faintly now, casting an eerie blue light across the room. I stumbled back, my feet slipping on the icy floor, and fell hard onto the frost-covered bed. The cold bit through my clothes, sharp and relentless, and I scrambled to my feet, desperate to get away. That's when I heard it. A soft whisper, faint and distant, like the wind through cracks in the wall. It didn't sound like words, but it was unmistakably a voice. It grew louder, coming from all around me, until it seemed to fill the room. My heart raced as I spun around, trying to find the source, but there was nothing there, just the frost, creeping closer. And then I saw the figure. It was faint at first, just a shadow against the frosted glass of the window. But as I watched, it grew clearer, more solid. A tall, thin silhouette with long, spindly limbs that didn't seem quite human. Its head tilted to one side, as if studying me, and I felt its gaze even though I couldn't see its eyes. The whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. The figure pressed a hand against the glass, and I watched in horror as it melted through, slipping into the room like smoke. It didn't move toward me, not at first. It just stood there, its head twitching slightly, its body radiating an unnatural cold that made my teeth chatter. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat felt frozen, the air thick and unyielding. The figure took a step closer, its movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. Its shadow stretched across the floor, long and dark, reaching toward me like it had a life of its own. I stumbled back, pressing myself against the icy wall, my breath coming in panicked gasps. The figure stopped a few feet away, and for a moment, everything was still. Then it raised one skeletal hand and pointed at me. The frost beneath my feet began to crackle, spreading up the walls and across the ceiling. The room grew impossibly cold, my breath freezing in midair and falling like tiny crystals. My vision blurred, the world around me fading into a haze of white. The figure didn't move, but I could feel it closing in, the cold wrapping around me like a vice. Just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, everything went black. When I woke up, the room was warm again. Sunlight streamed through the window, and the frost was gone, as if it had never been there. But the footprints remained, faint and barely visible, against the floorboards. My phone was sitting on the nightstand, its screen glowing faintly. The battery was full. I didn't stay to find out what had happened. I grabbed my things and left, leaving the apartment behind for good. But no matter where I go, I can still feel the cold. It lingers in the back of my mind, a chilling reminder of what I saw. And sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I swear I saw frost forming on the edges of my bed. The snow crunched beneath my boots as I made my way deeper into the forest. The cold bit at my face, and my breath hung in the air like pale ghosts. I hadn't meant to wander so far, but the silence of the trees and the beauty of the untouched snow pulled me in. The deeper I went, more the world seemed to disappear behind me. I was alone, or at least I thought I was. It started when I noticed something strange. The air had been still all morning, but suddenly, I felt a cold breeze pass through me. It wasn't natural, it felt icy, like it came from somewhere far colder than the forest around me. I stopped walking, looking around for the source, but there was nothing, just trees, snow, and shadows. Then I saw it. At first, it didn't make sense. Through the trees, half covered in frost and snow, was a door. Just a door, standing upright in the middle of the forest with no walls or building around it. It was tall, made of dark wood that looked ancient, with iron hinges that had frosted over. The edges were outlined with intricate carvings, though they were hard to make out beneath the thick layer of ice. I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. A door, here, in the middle of nowhere. My first thought was that someone had built it as part of a strange art project or maybe a forgotten piece of an old cabin. But the longer I looked, the less it felt like it belonged. I stepped closer, my curiosity outweighing my growing unease. The closer I got, the colder it became. The air felt heavy, as if the door itself was drawing all the warmth from the world around it. I reached out to touch it, but before my fingers could make contact, a deep chill raced up my arm, and I pulled back. There was something about it, something wrong. The carvings were clearer now, strange, symbols that didn't look like any language I'd ever seen. They seemed to shimmer faintly, even though the sun was hidden behind thick gray clouds. I couldn't shake the feeling that the door was waiting for me, daring me to open it. I should have walked away. I should have turned around and gone back the way I came, but something about the door drew me in, like it was pulling at the edges of my mind. Before I realized what I was doing, I gripped the frozen handle and pulled. It didn't budge. The door was sealed shut, but not in a way that seemed natural, like it was locked from the other side, held closed by something far stronger than any lock or bolt. Frustration and curiosity boiled over, and I pulled harder. The frost beneath my feet cracked as I braced myself, tugging with all my strength. Suddenly, the door gave way, swinging open with a sound that sent shivers down my spine. It wasn't a creak or a groan, it was a low, mournful wail, like the wind passing through a graveyard. Cold air rushed out from the opening, so cold it burned my skin. Beyond the door was darkness. Not the kind of darkness you see at night, but a thick, impenetrable void. It seemed to absorb the light around it, pulling it in and leaving nothing behind. I couldn't see anything beyond the threshold, but I could feel it. A presence. Something was in there, watching me. I stepped back, my heart pounding. The air around the door was freezing now, colder than anything I'd ever felt. My breath came in shallow gasps, and frost began to form on my clothes. I wanted to run, to slam the door shut and leave it behind, but my legs wouldn't move. Then I heard it, a whisper, soft and faint, coming from the darkness. It wasn't a voice I recognized, but it felt familiar in a way that made my stomach churn. The words were unclear, but they carried a weight that pressed down on me, filling my chest with dread. The whisper grew louder, joined by others, until it was a chorus of voices echoing from the void. They called out, pleading, warning, and tempting all at once. My hands trembled as I gripped the edges of the door, trying to steady myself. Come in. The words were clear this time, spoken in a voice that sounded eerily like my own. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but something held me in place. The darkness seemed to shift, moving closer, as if whatever was inside the door was leaning toward me. A sudden gust of wind blew through the forest, slamming the door shut with a force that rattled the ground beneath my feet. The whispers stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and stared at the door. Frost spread across its surface, sealing the edges once more. The carvings glowed faintly for a moment before fading back into the wood. The presence I had felt was gone, but the cold remained, lingering in the air like a warning. I turned and ran, not stopping until I was far from the forest. Even as I reached the edge of the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that the door was still watching me, waiting for me to return. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the door. I heard the whispers, and I felt the cold creeping into my bones like a memory I couldn't forget. The next morning, I told myself it was over, that I'd imagined it, but I couldn't bring myself to go back. Weeks passed, and though I tried to move on, the door haunted me. Then, I'd wake up in the middle of the night, the air in my room freezing, and hear a faint whisper that sounded just like my own voice. I know the door is still out there waiting, and deep down, I know it isn't finished with me. The ice stretched as far as I could see, smooth and glassy under the pale winter sun. I was exploring a remote glacier in the mountains, a place untouched by most people. The air was crisp and cold, and the silence around me felt heavy, as though the world was holding its breath. There was something about the stillness that made the hairs on my neck stand up. I had been walking for hours when I noticed something strange beneath the ice. At first, it looked like shadows, dark shapes, buried far below the frozen surface. But as I got closer, I realized they weren't shadows at all. They were buildings. I stopped, my breath fogging the air, and crouched down to get a better look. Beneath the thick ice, there was a town, rows of houses, a church steeple, and what looked like a small marketplace were all preserved perfectly, as though frozen in time. Buildings were old, with slanted roofs and narrow windows. The ice distorted the details, but I could see enough to know this wasn't just a natural formation. I pressed my gloved hand against the ice, staring down at the eerie sight. Who had lived here? How had an entire town ended up buried beneath a glacier? The questions swirled in my mind, but there were no answers. I should have left right then, but curiosity kept me rooted in place. There was something unsettling about the town, something I couldn't explain. The longer I looked, the more I felt like it was looking back at me. I decided to explore further. The ice was thick but clear, and as I walked, I could make out more details. The buildings were arranged in neat rows, with narrow streets running between them. There were frozen carts and barrels in the marketplace, as if the townspeople had left in the middle of their day. But there were no signs of people. Then I saw the first one. It was faint at first, just a shape at the edge of my vision. I thought it was another building, but when I moved closer, I realized it was a figure. A person, frozen beneath the ice, their face turned upward. They looked almost peaceful, their features pale and blurred by the frost. But there was something off about their expression, something too still, too empty. I stepped back, my heart pounding. My instinct told me to leave, to get far away from this place, but I couldn't. I kept moving, drawn deeper into the icy expanse. The further I went, the more figures I saw. They were scattered throughout the town, standing in doorways, sitting on benches, lying in the streets. All of them were frozen solid, their eyes open, staring up through the ice. The air grew colder, biting through my layers of clothing. The silence was unbearable now, pressing against my ears like a weight. Every step felt louder than it could, the crunch of my boots echoing in the emptiness. I told myself it was just the cold playing tricks on my mind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As I passed what looked like the town square, I saw something that made me stop in my tracks. At the center of the square was a massive block of ice, taller than the surrounding buildings. Inside it, there was a figure unlike the others. It was larger, towering over the frozen townspeople, and its shape was wrong. Its limbs were too long, its head too narrow. Even through the distortion of the ice, I could tell it wasn't human. I stared at it, my breath shallow and quick. The figure seemed to lean toward me, its face, or what I thought was its face, tilted, as though watching. A sudden, sharp crack echoed through the air, and I stumbled back, my heart racing. The sound came from beneath me. The ice had started to crack. Panic surged through me, and I turned to leave, but the ice beneath my feet groaned again. I froze, terrified that one wrong move would send me plunging into the frozen abyss. The silence returned, even heavier now, and I felt the hair on my arms stand on end. Then I heard it, a faint sound, like whispering, coming from beneath the ice. It wasn't just one voice, it was many, overlapping and murmuring in a language I didn't understand. The sound grew louder, more urgent, as if the voices were trying to tell me something. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The whispers were everywhere, surrounding me, filling my head. I looked down and saw the faces. The frozen figures were closer now, their eyes locked on me. Stumbled back, nearly losing my balance, and realized with horror that they had moved. They were no longer scattered randomly throughout the town. They were all facing me, their expressions empty and accusing. The cracks in the ice spread rapidly, jagged lines snaking toward me. The whispers turned to screams, a deafening cacophony that made me clamp my hands over my ears. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. The air grew colder still, the frost up my boots and biting into my skin. Then the ice gave way. I fell, plunging into the freezing water. The cold was like 1,000 needles piercing my body, and I gasped, choking as icy water filled my lungs. I tried to swim, to claw my way back to the surface, but the current pulled me deeper. Through the swirling darkness, I saw them, the frozen figures, their eyes open and lifeless, reaching for me. And then I saw it. The towering figure from the square loomed in the darkness, its long limbs moving with unnatural grace. Its eyes glowed faintly, a pale blue light that cut through the shadows. It reached for me, its fingers impossibly long and sharp, and I felt the cold spread through my chest, stealing the last of my strength. When I woke up, I was lying on the snow, gasping for air. The town was gone, the ice smooth and unbroken beneath me. The whispering had stopped, but the silence was worse. I staggered too, my feet shivering uncontrollably, and stumbled away from the glacier. I don't know how I survived. I don't know what I saw, or why it let me go. But sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I hear the whispers again, and when I close my eyes, I see the town beneath the ice, waiting. It's still out there, and I know it hasn't forgotten me. The snowstorm had come out of nowhere. One minute, I was walking through the woods, enjoying the quiet solitude, and the next, the wind was howling, whipping snow into my face so hard I could barely see. The world around me had vanished into a blinding white, and I couldn't even tell which direction I had come from. I pulled my scarf tighter, trying to shield my face from the biting cold. Panic was creeping in. The trees had disappeared into the storm, and I felt like I was walking in circles. The snow, erasing my footprints almost as soon as I made them. The cold was sinking into my bones. The thought of being trapped out here, alone, was growing more real with every passing minute. Then I saw a light. It was faint at first, a flicker in the distance. I thought it was my imagination, a trick of the storm. But when I blinked and looked again, it was still there. It looked like the soft glow of a lantern, swaying gently as if someone was carrying it. Relief flooded through me. Someone else was out here. Maybe they could help me find my way back. I started toward the light, my boots sinking into the deep snow with every step. The wind made it hard to see, but the light was steady, always just ahead of me. It flickered occasionally, but it never went out. "Hello?" I called out, my voice swallowed by the storm. "Is someone there?" There was no answer, but the light moved, bobbing gently, as if it wanted me to follow. I hesitated for a moment, unease prickling at the back of my mind. Something about the way it moved didn't feel quite right, but the thought of staying in the storm, freezing to death, was worse. I clenched my fists and pushed forward. The light led me deeper into the storm, away from the trees and into what felt like an open field. The snow was falling harder now, stinging my skin and blurring my vision. I kept my eyes on the light, afraid that if I looked away, I would lose it. It felt like my only chance of getting out of this alive. But as I got closer, I noticed something strange. The light didn't seem to be coming from a lantern after all. It was too bright, too steady, and it didn't cast any shadows on the snow. It just hovered there, an unnatural glow in the swirling storm. My unease grew stronger, but I couldn't stop. Something about the light drew me in, like it was pulling me forward against my will. The wind howled louder, and the storm seemed to close in around me. The world felt smaller, like the snow was forming a barrier, trapping me with the light. My heart pounded in my chest, but I kept walking, my feet moving on their own. I called out again, louder this time, my voice shaking. "Who's there? What do you want?" No response. The light flickered again, then stopped moving. It hovered a few feet ahead of me, glowing brighter now, almost blinding. I shielded my eyes with my hand, trying to see what was behind it. But there was nothing, just the endless, swirling snow. I took another step forward, and the ground beneath me shifted. A sickening crack echoed through the storm, and I froze. My heart stopped as I looked down and saw the snow beneath my feet splintering. Ice. I was standing in a frozen lake, and I hadn't even realized it. The cracks spread outward in jagged lines, and I could hear the deep, ominous groan of the ice struggling to hold my weight. The light flickered again, and this time, it moved closer. Too close. I stumbled back, the ice groaning louder under my shifting weight. The light wasn't just floating anymore, it was alive. It pulsed, growing brighter and dimmer, like a heartbeat. And then, for the first time, I saw something behind it. A shadow. It was faint, barely visible through the glow, but it was there. A tall, thin figure, its limbs unnaturally long, standing just behind the light, its head tilted to one side, and I felt its gaze pierce through me, even though I couldn't see its eyes. The air grew colder, so cold it hurt to breathe, and I realized with a jolt of terror that the storm had gone silent. No wind, no howling, just the sound of the ice cracking beneath me, and my own ragged breaths. The figure stepped forward, and the light moved with it, illuminating the frozen lake. I could see it more clearly now, its body unnaturally twisted, its movements slow and deliberate. My legs felt like they were made of lead, but I forced myself to move, taking a shaky step back. The ice groaned louder, and I knew I was out of time. I turned and ran, the light and shadow behind me growing brighter, closer. The ice cracked and splintered with every step, and I could hear the water beneath it, dark and waiting. My lungs burned as I ran, the cold air slicing through me like knives. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel it following me. The light grew brighter still, casting my shadow on the ice in front of me. The shadow twisted and stretched, and for a moment, it didn't look like mine at all. And then the ice gave way. I fell, plunging into the freezing water. The cold hit me like a shock, stealing the air from my lungs. I thrashed, trying to find the surface, but the ice was above me, unbroken. The light glowed faintly through the ice, and I could see the figure standing above me, watching. I pounded on the ice, desperate for air, but it was no use. My vision blurred, the cold dragging me deeper, and the last thing I saw was the light, flickering one last time before everything went dark. When I woke up, I was lying on the shore, gasping for air. The storm was gone, the sky clear and blue. The lake was still and frozen, no cracks, no sign of what had happened. But I knew it wasn't over. The light hadn't let me go, it had spared me. For now, and every time I close my eyes, I see it flickering in the distance, waiting for me to follow again. The snow was falling heavily, blanketing the forest in white and muffling every sound. I was alone, hiking a trail I had walked 100 times before. The cold air stung my face, and my boots crunched with each step. It should have been peaceful, but something about the silence felt wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The trail was barely visible beneath the snow, but I knew it well enough to follow. The trees loomed like shadowy figures, their bare branches twisting in the wind. I pulled my coat tighter, trying to ignore the unease creeping into my chest. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a shape in the snow, maybe a fallen log, or a mound of drifted snow. But as I got closer, the shape became clearer. It was a person, lying half buried in the snow. My heart raced as I rushed forward, my breath fogging the freezing air. The figure was motionless, their body twisted awkwardly, one arm stretched out as if reaching for something. I knelt beside them, brushing the snow from their face and froze. It was me. I stared in disbelief at the pale, frozen face beneath the snow. It was like looking in a mirror, but this wasn't a reflection. It was my face, my body, my clothes. Everything was the same. The hair, the scar on my eyebrow, even the old hiking boots I was wearing at that very moment. I stumbled back, my stomach twisting in horror. My own frozen corpse lay in front of me, the lifeless eyes staring up at nothing. The snow clung to the cold, lifeless skin, and frost had formed on the edges of my hair. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. This couldn't be real. I looked around, half expecting to see someone else, someone who could explain what was happening. But the forest was empty, silent except for the wind. It felt like the world had stopped, leaving me alone with the impossible. I turned back to the body and noticed something I hadn't seen before. There were footprints leading away from it, half covered by the falling snow. They weren't mine. The pattern didn't match my boots, and they were much larger. They led deeper into the forest, disappearing into the white haze. Against every instinct screaming at me to run, I followed the footprints. The snow fell harder as I walked, the wind whipping around me like it was trying to push me back. The trail twisted through the trees, the footprints growing fainter with every step. My breath came in sharp gasps, more from fear than exertion. I kept glancing over my shoulder, certain I would see something or some following me, but the forest behind me was empty. The footprints led to a clearing, and I stopped at the edge, my heart pounding. In the center of the clearing stood a figure. They were tall, their body obscured by a long, dark coat, and they didn't move. The air around them seemed colder, the snow falling in strange, slow spirals. I called out, my voice shaking, "Who are you? What is this?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, they turned slowly, their face hidden beneath a deep hood. But I didn't need to see their face to know they were looking at me. I could feel their gaze, heavy, unrelenting, like ice pressing down on my chest. They raised an arm and pointed behind me. I turned, dread coiling in my stomach, and saw another body lying in the snow, my body. I staggered back, my legs nearly giving out. It was identical to the first, the same twisted pose, the same frozen expression. My own dead eyes stared back at me, and the world seemed to tilt. I spun around to face the figure, but they were gone. The clearing was empty. Panic gripped me, and I ran. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away. The trees blurred as I stumbled through the snow, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But no matter how far I ran, the cold followed. The wind howled, carrying whispers I couldn't understand, voices that seemed to come from the trees themselves. I tripped and fell, the snow swallowing me whole. When I looked up, I was back where I started. The first body, my body was still there, half buried in the snow. My heart pounded as I scrambled to my feet. The forest was spinning, the trees closing in like a cage. And then I heard it, a soft crunching sound, like footsteps in the snow. It was slow, deliberate, and it was coming closer. I turned, searching for the source, but the storm made it impossible to see. The sound grew louder, closer, until I felt like it was right behind me. I spun around, expecting to see the figure again, but there was nothing, only the snow and the trees. I turned back toward the body, desperate to leave, but the corpse was gone. The snow, where it had been, was untouched, as if it had never been there. The footsteps started again, this time circling me. I shouted into the storm, my voice cracking. "What do you want? Why are you doing this?" No answer, just the wind, the snow, the sound of footsteps. And then I saw them. Dozens of bodies lay in the snow, scattered across the forest floor. They were all me, each one frozen in a different position. Some were reaching out, some were curled up, and some were standing upright, their eyes open and lifeless. My head spun, and I felt the cold sinking into my bones deeper than before. The footsteps stopped, and I felt a presence behind me. I didn't want to turn around, but something forced me to. The figure was there, standing impossibly close. Their hood had fallen back, and I saw their face. It was my face. But it wasn't just a reflection. Their features were sharper, their eyes, and their expression was void of anything human. They tilted their head, studying me, and I felt my body go numb. Before I could move, they raised a hand and placed it on my chest. The cold was unbearable, freezing me from the inside out. My vision blurred, and the world faded into darkness. When I woke up, I was lying in the snow. My body was stiff, my limbs frozen. I tried to move, but I couldn't. I was trapped, unable to speak, unable to scream. Above me, the figure stood, watching. They tilted their head again, and for the first time, they smiled. Now, I wait. I don't know if anyone will find me, or if I'll fade into the snow like the others. All I know is that I am not alone, and somewhere, out there, another me is still walking. It started with the sound of crying. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard it soft, muffled, sobbing coming from outside my window. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, but as I woke up fully, the sound became clearer. It was unmistakable. Someone was crying. I sat up, my heart already racing. My bedroom was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamp outside. The sound continued, a pitiful, heart-wrenching wail that made the hair on my arms stand up. It wasn't the kind of crying you'd expect from someone sad. It was desperate, almost inhuman. I checked the time. Midnight. I live alone, in a small house at the edge of town. There aren't many people around, especially at this hour, and the thought of someone standing outside my window in the middle of the night sent a chill through me. I stayed in bed, listening, hoping the sound would stop, but it didn't. Anything. It grew louder, more frantic. Gathering my courage, I got up and walked to the window. My hands shook as I pulled back the curtain. The sobbing stopped immediately, leaving a silence so heavy it felt like the world had gone still. My breath fogged the glass as I stared out into the darkness. There was no one there. The street lamp illuminated the empty yard and the road beyond it. The snow on the ground was undisturbed, pristine and untouched. I told myself it must have been the wind, or maybe some animal. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The crying had sounded too real, too human. I closed the curtain and went back to bed, pulling the blankets up to my chin. My heart was still racing, and every little sound made me jump. The creak of the house settling, the faint hum of the heater, everything felt louder, more sinister. I told myself to calm down, that it was just my imagination, and then it started again. The crying was louder this time, more insistent. It sounded closer, like it was right outside the window. My blood ran cold. I wanted to ignore it, to pretend I hadn't heard it, but my curiosity got the better of me. I got up and went to the window again, my footsteps feeling heavy, slow. The sobbing stopped the moment I touched the curtain. I froze, my hand hovering over the fabric, unsure if I should look. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt the weight of the silence pressing down on me. I opened the curtain. This time there was someone there. A figure stood in the yard, just beyond the reach of the street lamp's light. It was hard to make out any details, but I could tell they were tall, with long, dark hair hanging down over their face. They were facing the house, facing me. I stumbled back, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might burst. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. They just stood there, motionless, watching. I grabbed my phone, my fingers fumbling as I tried to unlock it. I thought about calling the police, but when I glanced back out the window, the yard was empty. The figure was gone. I stared out into the night, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The snow was still untouched. No footprints leading to or from the spot where the figure had stood. I told myself I was imagining things, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the crying again, faint and distant, like it was coming from somewhere just out of reach. The next night, it happened again. The crying started at midnight, soft and sorrowful. I tried to ignore it, pulling the blankets over my head and squeezing my eyes shut, but it only grew louder, more insistent. It sounded closer than before, like it was coming from right outside my bedroom wall. I couldn't take it anymore. I got up and turned on every light in the house, hoping the brightness would scare away whatever was out there. But when I looked out the window, the yard was empty again. The crying stopped the moment I looked outside, leaving me in an eerie, suffocating silence. I stayed awake until morning, my nerves frayed, and my body trembling with exhaustion. When the sun finally rose, I went outside to check the yard. The snow was still untouched. Not a single footprint anywhere near my house. It didn't make sense. That night, I decided to stay awake and see if I could catch whoever or whatever was out there. I sat in the dark, the curtains drawn back just enough to let me see outside. Midnight came, and the crying started again. This time I saw it. The figure appeared just as the sobbing grew louder. It was standing closer to the house now, barely illuminated by the street lamp. I could see more details this time. Their clothes were tattered, their body thin and frail. Their head hung low, the hair obscuring their face. I watched, frozen with fear, as the figure slowly lifted its head. The face was wrong. The features were pale and sunken, the eyes black pits that seemed to stare straight through me. Its mouth opened wide, wider than any human mouth should, and the crying turned into a piercing wail that made my ears ring. I stumbled back from the window, my heart pounding as the sound grew louder, filling the room. I clapped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The sound was inside my head, an unbearable, bone-deep sorrow that made me want to scream. And then it stopped. I looked back at the window, but the figure was gone. The silence was deafening, and I felt a cold, heavy presence lingering in the room. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The crying hasn't stopped. Every night at midnight, it returns, louder and closer than before. I've stopped looking out the window, but I can feel it now, just outside the glass. And sometimes I hear it inside the house. The ice stretched out before me, smooth and glassy, reflecting the pale gray sky above. I was walking on the frozen lake, something I had done countless times before, in the winter months. The cold bit at my face, and my breath fogged the air, but the quiet stillness of the frozen world around me was comforting in its way. I had come out here to clear my mind, to escape the noise of daily life, but the further I walked, the more isolated I felt. The lake seemed endless, the horizon where the ice met the sky. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavy, oppressive, like the world was holding its breath. That's when I saw it. I stopped mid-step, my boots skidding slightly on the ice. Beneath me, the surface was clear, almost like glass, and I could see my reflection staring back. At first, it was just a faint outline, distorted by the subtle cracks and imperfections in the ice. But as I stood there, the reflection became clearer, sharper. It wasn't just my reflection, it was me. The figure below mimicked my every move, tilting its head when I did, raising a hand as I reached out toward the ice. But there was something wrong about it. The eyes stared back with an intensity that made my stomach twist. It didn't feel like looking at a reflection. It felt like looking at another person. I crouched down, placing my hand on the ice, and the figure below did the same. I told myself it was just my imagination, the way the ice played tricks on the light. But then it moved. Not with me before me. The reflection's hand slid across the ice slower than my own. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, as the figure below smiled. The grin was too wide, too sharp, and it didn't belong to me. I stumbled back, my boots slipping on the ice, and fell hard onto the frozen surface. The impact sent a sharp pain through my arm, but I barely noticed. My eyes were locked on the ice, on the thing beneath it. The reflection didn't follow me this time. It stayed crouched, watching me, its smile never faltering. I scrambled to my feet, the cold seeping through my clothes. The wind picked up, howling across the lake, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The ocean stood, slowly, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. I turned and ran. The ice groaned beneath my boots as I sprinted toward the shore. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel it. That presence beneath the ice, following me, matching my every step. The sound of my own breath filled my ears, and my heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst. The shore was close now, the edge of the lake just a few feet away. Relief surged through me, but as I took my final step, the ice cracked. A deafening sound echoed across the lake, and I fell forward onto the snow-covered ground, turned back, gasping, and saw the ice splitting in long, jagged lines. The cracks raced toward the cracks, center of the lake, where the reflection had been, but it wasn't there anymore. The surface of the ice was empty, smooth and untouched, as though nothing had happened. The figure was gone. For a moment, I thought it was over, that I had imagined the whole thing. But then I saw them footprints. They were faint, but they were there, leading away from the cracks and across the lake. My stomach churned as I realized they weren't heading toward me. They were heading away, toward the trees on the far side of the lake. I didn't stay to see where they went. I ran home, slamming the door behind me and locking it, even though I knew a lock wouldn't stop something like that. My hands were shaking, and my breath came in shallow gasps as I tried to convince myself it was over. But it wasn't. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the reflection smile, the way it moved before I did. The wind outside sounded like whispers, and every creak of the house made my heart race. When I finally drifted off, it wasn't for long. I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside my window. Slow, deliberate, crunching in the snow. My chest tightened as I sat up, my eyes darting to the glass. There was nothing there, just the empty yard, lit faintly by the moonlight. But the sound didn't stop. It was coming closer, circling the house. I forced myself to move, grabbing a flashlight and heading to the window. My hand trembled as I pulled back the curtain, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The footprints were there, fresh in the snow, leading straight to my front door. But there was no one in sight. I turned on every light in the house, my pulse racing. I checked the locks on every door and window, but it didn't make me feel any safer. The footprints outside lead away. Whoever or whatever had made them was still out there. The next morning, I went back to the lake, desperate for answers. The ice was smooth again, the cracks gone, and my reflection stared back at me like nothing had happened. For a moment, I thought I was safe, but as I turned to leave, I noticed something beneath the ice, faint but unmistakable. Another reflection walking in the opposite direction. It wasn't following me this time. It was leading the way. I was trudging through the snow, the biting wind cutting into my face. Before had blanketed the ground in thick drifts, making every step an effort. I wasn't out there, for Funai was searching for my missing glove, the one I'd dropped on my walk the previous evening. I thought it was silly to worry about something so small, but it was a gift, and I didn't want to lose it. The street was quiet, the kind of silence that only comes after a heavy snowfall. The houses were hidden under layers of white, and the road was barely visible beneath the ice. I followed my footprints from the day before, now faint and half covered, scanning the ground as I walked. That's when I saw it. Half buried in a snowbank at the edge of the sidewalk was something small and rectangular. At first, I thought it was just a piece of trash, maybe a wrapper or a torn flyer, but as I got closer, realized it was a photograph. I knelt in the snow, brushing away the frost, and froze. It was me. The photo was old and faded, the edges worn and curled from time. It showed me standing in a field of snow, wearing a coat I hadn't owned in years. My hand slightly away from the camera, but it was unmistakably me. I stared at it, my breath fogging the air, trying to understand how this was possible. I didn't remember this photo being taken. I didn't remember being in that field. But it wasn't just the scene that felt wrong, it was the expression on my face. I wasn't smiling. My eyes looked hollow, like I wasn't really there. A shiver ran down my spine, and not from the cold. I turned the photo over, hoping for some clue, but the back was blank. There was no writing, no date, nothing to explain where it had come from or why it was here. I stood up, gripping the photo tightly. My glove was forgotten now. I looked around, half expecting to see someone watching me, but the street was empty. The houses stood silent, their windows dark. The feeling of being watched crept over me, and I stuffed the photo into my pocket, my fingers trembling. I hurried home, the snow crunching beneath my boots, but the unease stayed with me. When I got back, I locked the door behind me and pulled out the photo again, studying it under the light. The longer I looked, the stranger it seemed. The field in the background wasn't one I recognized, but there was something familiar about it, something I couldn't quite place. And then I noticed something I hadn't seen before. There was a shadow in the photo, faint and blurry, standing just behind me. It was hard to make out, but it didn't look like a person. The shape was wrong, twisted, like something that didn't belong I dropped the photo onto the table, my stomach churning. This couldn't be real. It had to be a prank, some kind of cruel joke. But no one had been out there, and there was no way anyone could have known I'd find it. That night I couldn't sleep. The photo was still sitting on the table, and every time I closed my eyes I saw that shadow. The house was silent, but the silence felt like it was pressing down on me. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside made my skin crawl. Just after midnight I heard something. At first I thought it was the wind, but it wasn't. It was faint, almost like a whisper, coming from outside. My heart raced as I got out of bed and crept to the window. The snow was still falling, lightly, and the street was empty. But the whispering continued, low and constant, just beyond the glass. I pressed my ear to the window, trying to make out the words, but they didn't make sense. It was like a voice speaking a language I didn't know. And then I saw it. In the street, standing in the snow, was a figure. It was tall and thin, its body barely visible in the dim light. It wasn't moving, but I could feel it staring at me, even though I couldn't see its face. The whispering grew louder, more urgent, and I stumbled back from the window, my chest tight with fear. When I looked again, the figure was gone. The street was empty, the snow untouched. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I stayed in the living room, the photo lying face down on the table, afraid to even look at it. The whispers stopped, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. The next morning, I decided to get rid of the photo. I couldn't keep it in the housenout after what I'd seen. I took it outside, my breath fogging in the icy air, and walked to the trash bin at the end of the driveway. But when I opened the bin, the photo wasn't in my pocket anymore. Panic set in as I searched my coat, my jeans, the ground around me. It was gone. I went back. Inside, tearing the house apart, but I couldn't find it. It was like it had vanished. That night, the whispering started again. This time it was louder, closer, like it was coming from inside the house. I locked every door, every window, but it didn't help. The whispers filled the air, and I could feel something moving, just out of sight. And then, in the middle of the night, I saw it. The photo was back, sitting on the table where I'd left it the first time, but it wasn't the same. The shadow in the background was clearer now, closer, and my reflection in the photo was looking directly at me. Its eyes were empty, its mouth twisted into a grin that wasn't mine. I don't know what's happening, or what the photo wants from me, but I can feel it watching me. Now, even when I am not looking at it, the whispers won't stop, and every time I close my eyes, I see that shadow. I don't think I am alone anymore, and I don't think I ever was. When I opened my eyes, I knew something was wrong. I was lying on the ground, the faint smell of damp earth and snow in the air. The last thing I remembered was camping in the forest. I had fallen asleep in my tent, surrounded by familiar trees and the quiet sounds of the wilderness. But now, as I sat up, I realized I wasn't in the forest anymore. I was in a village. Small houses made of weathered wood lined a narrow, snow-covered street. Smoke curled lazily from a few chimneys, and a soft wind carried the faint smell of burning wood. The air was eerily silent, except for the occasional creak of old shutters swaying in the breeze. I looked around, disoriented and cold. This village hadn't been here yesterday. I stood slowly, brushing snow from my clothes, and tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The houses looked ancient, their roofs sagging under the weight of time. Frost covered the windows, and the door frames were warped, as if the entire place had been forgotten for years. I called out, my voice breaking the silence. "Hello? Is anyone here?" The echo of my words faded quickly, swallowed by the stillness. No one answered. My heart pounded as I walked toward the nearest house. The snow crunched under my boots, and loud in the otherwise silent street. I peered through the frosted window but couldn't see much. Inside, just shadows and shapes, nothing that made sense. The door was slightly ajar, creaking softly as it moved in the wind. I hesitated, then pushed it open. The house was cold and dim, the faint light from the overcast sky filtering through cracks in the walls. Dust hung in the air, and the floor was covered in a thin layer of frost. A table sat in the center of the room, surrounded by wooden chairs, and an old fireplace loomed against one wall. But there was no one there. The strangest thing was the feeling. It didn't feel like an abandoned house. The table was set, with plates and utensils, as if someone had been preparing to eat. A half-empty cup sat on the counter, the liquid inside frozen solid. It was as though the people who lived here had vanished in the middle of their day. I stepped back outside, my breath fogging in the cold air. The unease in my chest was growing. The village was too quiet. There were no footprints in the snow, no sign that anyone had been here for a very long time. As I turned to leave, I saw movement. At the far end of the street, a figure stood. They were too far away for me to make out any details, but they didn't move. They just stood there, watching. My stomach tightened, and I called out again, louder this time. "Hello? Who are you?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, they turned and walked around the corner, behind one of the houses. Against every instinct telling me to leave, I followed. My boots slipped on the icy ground as I hurried after them, my pulse racing. When I rounded the corner, the figure was gone. Instead, I found myself standing in front of a well. It was old, its stones crumbling and covered in frost. A wooden bucket dangled from a frayed rope, swaying slightly in the wind. I stepped closer, peering into the darkness below. The sound of dripping water echoed up from the well, faint and rhythmic. But as I listened, dripping turned into something else, a soft, almost melodic humming. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, resonating from deep within the earth. I backed away, my breath catching in my throat. The humming wasn't just a sound, it was a feeling, a vibration that seemed to crawl under my skin. The wind picked up, swirling snow around me, and I turned to leave. That's when I saw them. Figures were standing in the windows of the houses, their faces pale and featureless, pressed against the glass. They didn't move, didn't blink, just watched. My legs felt like lead as I took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest. I spun around, desperate to get away, but the street wasn't empty anymore. The figures were there too, standing motionless in the snow. Their shapes were hazy, like they weren't fully solid, and their faces, if you could call them, that were empty voids. I stumbled back, tripping over the uneven ground, and fell hard onto the ice. The cold seeped through my clothes, but I barely felt it. My eyes were locked on the figures as they began to move, slow and deliberate, closing the distance between us. The humming grew louder, filling the air, and I realized it was coming from them. Their movements were synchronized, unnatural, as if they were all being controlled by the same invisible force. I scrambled to my feet and ran, the cold biting at my skin and the sound of my blast's own panicked breaths drowning out the humming. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stay there. I ran past the houses, past the well, into the open field beyond the village. The snow was deep, and every step was a struggle. But I didn't stop. The humming was still behind me, growing louder, closer. When I finally looked back, the village was gone. The field was empty, the horizon stretching out in every direction. The only sound was the wind and my own ragged breathing. My legs gave out, and I collapsed into the snow, my body trembling with cold and fear. I don't know how long I lay there before I finally stood and started walking. The village hadn't been there yesterday, and now it was gone again. But I could still hear the faint echo of the humming, like it had followed me. Even now, I can't escape it. The sound is always there, just at the edge of hearing, a constant reminder that the village wasn't a dream. And sometimes, late at night, I see shapes in the corners of my vision-pale, motionless figures watching me from the shadows. I know they're waiting, and I don't think they'll wait forever. The snowstorm swallowed the world around me. Thick flakes of snow whipped through the air, carried by howling winds that made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. He had been following was gone, buried under layers of snow. I was completely alone in the freezing, blinding white. At first, I had been confident I could find my way back. I had hiked this path before, and even though the storm came on suddenly. I thought I knew the general direction of safety, but the longer I walked, the more disoriented I became. The wind was relentless, and the cold seeped into my bones, making my legs heavy and my fingers numb. I stopped for a moment to catch my breath, pulling my scarf tighter around my face. That's when I saw it movement in the distance. It was faint, just a flicker in the corner of my vision, but it was there, a shadow shifting through the snow. My heart skipped a beat. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely carrying over the roar of the storm. "Is someone there?" No answer. The shadow was gone. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me in the storm. But as I started walking again, the unease grew. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The wind seemed to carry whispers, faint and distant, words I couldn't understand. Then I saw it again. This time the shadow was closer. It moved quickly, darting between the trees. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, straining to see through the snow. The figure was tall and thin, its shape distorted and unnatural. It didn't move like a person, it was too smooth, too fluid. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice shaking. Again, no answer, but I could feel it watching me. I turned and started walking faster, my boots crunching through the snow. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to get away, to keep moving, but the storm made it almost impossible. The wind pushed against me, and the cold burned my skin. I glanced over my shoulder and saw the shadow again, closer this time. It wasn't alone. There were more of them now, faint shapes moving through the storm, circling me like predators. My chest tightened, and I broke into a run, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The snow was deep, and every step felt like I was dragging my legs through quicksand. The shadows moved effortlessly, gliding across the snow without leaving a trace. Panic surged through me as I realized they were closing in. I couldn't outrun them. I could barely see where I was going, and the storm seemed to grow stronger with every passing second. The wind howled like a living thing, and the whispers grew louder, surrounding me. I stumbled and fell, the snow breaking my fall but stealing what little warmth I had left. Scrambled to my feet, my hands trembling, and looked around. The shadows were everywhere. Now, their dark forms blending with the storm. They didn't have faces, but I could feel their eyes on me, cold and unblinking. One of them stepped closer. I backed away, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. The shadow loomed over on me, its shape shifting and twisting like smoke caught in the wind. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. The cold was unbearable now, a deep, unnatural chill that seemed to seep into my very soul. Then the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, heavy, and oppressive. The shadow in front of me raised a long, spindly arm, its hand stretching toward me. I stumbled back, tripping over a buried branch, and landed hard in the snow. The shadows moved closer, their shapes blending into one another, forming a dark mass that surrounded me. I don't know how long I lay there, frozen in fear, but eventually, I forced myself to move. I pushed myself up and ran, not caring which direction I was going. The shadows followed, their movements impossibly fast and fluid. They glided over the snow, their dark forms flickering like dying flames. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The storm was disorienting, and my body was screaming for rest, but I didn't dare stop. The whispers started again, louder now, as if the shadows were speaking directly into my mind. The words were sharp and guttural, filled with malice. Ahead, through the swirling snow, I saw a faint light. Hope surged through me, and I ran towards it, ignoring the burning in my legs and the ice clinging to my clothes. The light grew brighter, cutting through the storm, and I realized it was coming from a small cabin. It looked old and weathered, its roof sagging under the weight of the snow, but it was shelter. I reached the door and threw it open, stumbling inside. The warmth hit me like a wave, and I collapsed onto the wooden floor, gasping for air. The door slammed shut behind me, and the whispers stopped. For a moment, I thought I was safe. Then I noticed the room. The walls were lined with shelves, and every surface was covered in strange objects, faded photographs, rusted tools, and jars filled with things I didn't recognize. A fire burned in the hearth, but it didn't feel warm. The flames were dim and unnatural, casting long, flickering shadows across the room. And then I saw them. The shadows were inside. They moved along the walls, stretching and twisting, their shapes distorted by the firelight. I backed away, my chest tight with fear, but there was nowhere to go. The room was small, and the shadows were everywhere. One of them peeled away from the wall, its dark form solidifying as it stepped toward me. It didn't make a sound, but I could feel its presence, heavy and suffocating. I tried to move, but my terror body wouldn't obey. The shadow reached out, its hand inches from my face, and the whispers filled my mind, deafening and endless. Then everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying in the snow. The storm was gone, and above was clear and bright. The cabin was nowhere to be seen, and the shadows were gone. But the cold remained, deep and unrelenting, as if a part of the storm had stayed with me. I don't know how I escaped or why they let me go, but sometimes, when the wind howls at night, I hear the whispers again, faint and distant, and I know the shadows are still watching, waiting. The chalet stood at the edge of the forest, surrounded by a heavy silence. Its roof sagged under the weight of snow, and the windows were dark, like empty eyes watching me. I had found it, after hours of hiking through the woods, caught in a sudden snowstorm. I was cold, exhausted, and desperate for shelter. I hesitated at the door, unsure if entering was a good idea. The place looked abandoned, the wooden walls weathered and covered in frost, but the thought of spending the night outside in the storm was worse. My fingers, numb from the cold, struggled to turn the rusted doorknob. The door creaked open with a sound that sent shivers down my spine. Inside, the air was stale and cold. Dust covered the furniture, and cobwebs hung from the corners. A small fireplace sat at the far end of the room, its chimney clogged with debris. The place felt untouched, like no one had been there in years. I closed the door behind me, the wind howling outside, and took a deep breath. It would have to do. I found an old chair near the fireplace and pulled it closer to the hearth. Using some scraps of wood I found stacked nearby, I managed to start a fire. The flames cast flickering shadows on the walls, and for a moment, the warmth eased my nerves. I told myself I was safe. It was just a storm, and the chalet was nothing more than an empty building. But as the night deepened, the silence became heavier. The wind outside seemed to grow louder, and the shadows on the walls shifted strangely, as though the firelight wasn't the only thing making them move. I tried to ignore it, wrapping myself in my jacket and leaning back in the chair. My body was exhausted, and despite the eerie atmosphere, I eventually fell asleep. I woke up in the middle of the night, and everything was wrong. The fire had gone out, leaving the room in near darkness. The air was freezing, and my breath came out in visible puffs. The silence was no longer comforting, it felt alive, pressing in on me from all sides. I sat up, every muscle in my body tense, and listened. That's when I heard it, a faint creaking sound, like footsteps on old wood. It came from upstairs, slow and deliberate, each step heavy enough to echo through the chalet. My heart raced as I stared at the ceiling, the sound growing louder. Someone or something was up there. I told myself it was just the wind, that the storm was making the building groan. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The steps were too deliberate, too human. My mind raced, trying to think of what to do. Should I call out, run, hide? Before I could decide, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable. I strained to hear anything, my ears ringing from the tension. And then I heard another sound, soft, faint, but unmistakable. Breathing. It was coming from the corner of the room. I turned my head slowly, afraid of what I might see. In the darkness, I could just make out a figure, crouched low and motionless. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it was watching me. Its shape was wrong, twisted and unnatural, its limbs too long for its body. I wanted to scream, but fear had paralyzed me. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but its presence was suffocating. The room felt colder now, the air thick with dread. My mind screamed at me to do something, to run, but I couldn't move. And then it stood up. The movement was sudden, jerky, like it didn't quite know how to use its body. It stepped closer, its bare feet silent on the wooden floor. The firelight flickered weakly, and for a brief moment, I saw its face, or what was left of it. Its features were pale and stretched, its eyes sunken, empty, and its mouth hung open in a silent scream. I stumbled back, knocking over the chair as I scrambled to my feet. My hands fumbled for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The wood was frozen solid, the knob covered in ice. Behind me, the figure moved closer, its breathing loud and ragged. Desperate, I grabbed a piece of wood from the fireplace and swung it wildly. The figure recoiled, but it didn't stop. It kept coming, its twisted limbs moving faster now, the sound of its breathing filling the room. I turned and ran toward the stairs, my boots slipping on the icy floor. The second floor was just as cold and dark as the first, the windows covered in frost. I slammed the door to one of the rooms behind me and pressed my back against it, trying to catch my breath. The breathing followed me. It was louder now, just outside the door. The wood creaked as the figure pressed against it, and I could see the knob turning slowly. I looked around the room, desperate for anything to defend myself with, but it was empty. The door burst open, and the figure stood there, its body filling the doorway. Its eyes locked onto mine, and I felt the cold spread through me, deeper than the snow outside. I backed away, my legs shaking, and hit the far wall. The figure moved closer, its hand reaching out. The fingers were long and bony, the skin stretched tight over the knuckles. I squeezed my eyes shut, waiting for the end. But nothing happened. When I opened my eyes, the figure was gone. The room was empty, the only sound my own ragged breathing. The cold remained, wrapping around me like a second skin, and the air felt heavy, as though something unseen was still there. I didn't wait to find out. I bolted down the stairs, throwing myself against the front door until it finally gave way. The storm had stopped, and the moon cast an eerie light over the snow-covered forest. I ran without looking back, the chalet disappearing into the trees behind me. Even now, I can't explain what happened. I don't know what that thing was, or why it was there. But sometimes when I close my eyes, I hear the sound of breathing, and I feel the cold. It started with the snow. The storm had rolled in overnight, blanketing the world in white by the time I woke up. Everything outside looked clean and untouched, the kind of silence only a fresh snowfall can bring. I stood by the window, sipping my coffee, when something strange caught my eye. There were footprints in the snow. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe they were from the mail carrier or a neighbor, though it was unusual for anyone to be out this early. But as I looked closer, a cold chill ran down my spine. The footprints didn't lead to my house, they led away from it. I set my coffee down, my hand shaking slightly. The tracks started at my front door, the deep impressions of boots leading out into the yard and disappearing toward the woods beyond. They were fresh, not yet dusted with snow, as though they had been made only moments ago. But I hadn't left the house. I threw on my coat and boots and stepped outside, the cold biting at my skin. The snow crunched under my feet as I approached the tracks. They were my size, my tread pattern. They were mine. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. I hadn't gone outside, hadn't made those tracks. But the evidence was there, clear as day. I followed them, each step sinking into the snow like a breadcrumb leading me away from the safety of my home. The tracks led across the yard and into the woods. The trees loomed tall and dark, their branches heavy with snow. The deeper I went, the quieter it became, the sound of the wind fading to nothing. The only noise was the crunch of my boots, overlapping tracks I was following. And then I saw something that made me stop. The footprints stopped too. Right in the middle of the woods, the tracks ended. There was no sign of turning back, no scuffle, No evidence that whoever or whatever had made them had gone anywhere else. They just stopped, as though the person had vanished into thin air. I turned in a slow circle, my breath visible in the freezing air. The forest around me was silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My heart pounded as I scanned the trees, half expecting to see someone or something hiding among the shadows. But there was nothing. I should have gone back then. I should have turned around and gone home, locked the door, tried to forget what I had seen. But something made me stay. Curiosity, maybe, or the lingering sense of unease that told me this wasn't over. That's when I noticed it. A second set of footprints. They weren't mine. These tracks were smaller, lighter, and they hadn't been there before. They led away from the spot where mine had ended, weaving deeper into the woods. My stomach churned as I stared at them, debating whether to follow. Against my better judgment, I did. The air grew colder the further I went, the snow clinging to my boots and weighing me down. The second set of tracks wound through the trees, leading me to a clearing I didn't recognize. I had been in these woods many times before, but this place felt different. Wrong somehow. In the center of the clearing was a small wooden cabin. I didn't remember it being there. It looked old, the wood darkened by age and frost. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney, though the windows were dark. The footprints led straight to the door, and my chest tightened as I realized I could hear something coming from inside. It was faint at first, barely audible over the pounding of my heart, but as I got closer, the sound became clearer. A voice, humming softly, a slow, mournful tune that made my skin crawl. I should have turned back. I should have run, but instead, stepped onto the porch, my boots creaking on the old wood. The door was slightly ajar, and the voice stopped the moment I reached it. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. "Is anyone there?" No answer. The silence was heavy, pressing against me like a weight. I pushed the door open, and the cabin's interior came into view. It was small, with a single room and a fireplace that glowed faintly with dying embers. The air was cold and smelled faintly of ash, but what caught my attention was the table in the center of the room. On it sat a photo. My photo. I stepped closer, my breath shallow. The photo was old and faded, but it was unmistakably me, standing in front of my house, wearing the same clothes I had on now. My face was turned slightly, my expression unreadable. My hands trembled as I picked up the photo, and that's when I noticed something even more unsettling. Behind me, in the photo, was a figure. It was blurred, its shape distorted, but it was there, standing just beyond my shoulder. The sound of creaking wood made me freeze. I turned slowly, my heart pounding, and saw them. The figure from the photo stood in the doorway, their face hidden in the shadows. Their body was thin and unnaturally still, as though they were holding their breath. I stumbled back, the photo slipping from my fingers, and the figure took a step forward. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice cracking. "What do you want?" They didn't answer. Instead, they raised a hand, pointing toward the floor. I followed their gesture and saw something that made my blood run cold. Another set of footprints, leading toward the cabin, and they weren't mine. It was in the back of an old antique shop, hidden behind a pile of dusty books and tarnished trinkets. I hadn't planned to stop there. It was a gray, cold day, and I had ducked inside to escape the biting wind. The shop was small and cluttered, the shelves crammed with forgotten objects that no one seemed to want. That's when I saw the snow globe. It sat on a wooden shelf, its glass surface catching the dim light filtering through the shop's windows. There was nothing remarkable about it at first glance. The base was simple, made of dark wood, and the scene inside was a tiny house, surrounded by trees, all covered in snow. Perfect, peaceful winter scene. But something about it drew me in. I picked it up, cradling it in my hands. The glass felt strangely warm, and the snow inside swirled lazily, even though I hadn't shaken it. I tilted it slightly to get a better look at the tiny house. Inside, it was an exact replica of my own. My breath caught in my throat. I turned the globe in my hands, inspecting it closely. The details were uncanny: the shape of the roof, the windows, even the small porch. It was my house, down to the last detail. I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling crawling up my spine. The shopkeeper, an older man with a graying beard, appeared behind me, startling me. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said, his voice soft. "You have a good eye. That piece is special." I looked at him, my fingers tightening around the globe. Where did this come from? He smiled faintly but didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked back toward the counter, leaving me alone. I thought about leaving it there, about walking away, but I couldn't. Something about the globe felt important, like I was meant to find it. I bought it. When I got home, the snowstorm outside had grown worse. The wind howled, and the windows rattled as I set the globe on the coffee table. It seemed out of place in my small, modern living room, but I couldn't stop staring at it. The tiny house inside looked even more detailed under the warm glow of the lamp. I shook it gently, watching the snow swirl and fall. The flakes drifted slowly, settling around the house, and for a moment I felt calm. But as I looked closer, something changed. The scene inside wasn't peaceful anymore. The tiny trees around the house were bare, their branches twisted and black. The snow on the ground had turned gray, and the sky inside the globe was dark. I leaned closer, my heart pounding, and that's when I saw it. A figure stood in the yard. It was small, barely visible among the trees, but it was there. Its shape was indistinct, almost like a shadow, but I could tell it was watching the house, watching me. My hands trembled, and I set the globe down quickly, backing away from the table. This wasn't possible. It was just a snow globe, just glass and water and tiny plastic pieces. But the longer I stared at it, the more real it felt. The figure inside hadn't moved, but I could feel its presence, heavy and oppressive, like it was waiting for something. I told myself I was imagining things. The storm outside was messing with my head. I turned off the light and went to bed, leaving the globe on the table. But I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the globe, the dark trees, the twisted branches, the shadowy figure standing in the yard. The wind outside sounded like whispers, faint and distant, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, because I woke to a loud crash. My heart leapt as I sat up, my ears straining to hear over the storm. The house was dark, the power out, and the only light came from the faint glow of the street lamp outside. I crept into the living room, my hands shaking. The coffee table was empty. The globe was gone. I turned on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, and searched the room. Globe was on the floor near the window, lying on its side. I picked it up carefully, expecting it to be broken, but the glass was intact. The scene inside had changed again. The tiny figure was gone, but the house wasn't empty. The windows glowed faintly, as though lights were on inside. I tilted the globe, trying to see better, and my stomach dropped. There was someone in the house. A tiny figure stood at the window, their face pressed against the glass. It was hard to make out the details, but I knew it wasn't just a decoration. It hadn't been there before. A knock at the window made me drop the globe. The sound echoed through the room, sharp and deliberate. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat. The curtains were drawn, but I could see a faint shadow behind them, tall and unmoving. Another knock, louder this time. I backed away, my pulse racing. The flashlight in my hand shook, the beam bouncing across the walls. I didn't want to open the curtains. I didn't want to see what was out there. But the knocking didn't stop. I took a deep breath and grabbed the edge of the curtain, pulling it back in one quick motion. There was nothing there. The snow outside was untouched, the yard empty, but the unease didn't go away. I turned back to the globe, which was lying on the floor, the snow inside swirling gently. The figure was back, standing in the yard, but this time, it wasn't alone. There were more of them, shadowy shapes, surrounding the house. Their dark forms were indistinct, but I could feel their eyes on me, cold and unblinking. And then I realized something else. The scene inside the globe wasn't just my house anymore. It was me. I was standing in the yard, surrounded by the figures, my tiny reflection staring back at me from the glass. The snow around my feet was red, and the sky above was dark, swirling with black clouds. My heart pounded as I stared at the scene, unable to look away. The wind outside grew louder, and I felt the temperature drop, the cold seeping into my skin. Whispers started again, faint but growing louder, filling the room. I don't remember what happened after that. The next thing I knew, I was lying on the floor, the house silent. The globe was gone. The storm had passed, and the first light of dawn was breaking through the window. But I don't feel safe. I can still hear the whispers, faint and distant, and sometimes I catch a glimpse of something moving in the corner of my eye. And when I look outside, I see footprints in the snow, leading toward the house. The blizzard hit suddenly, turning the world into a swirling, freezing white void. I had been hiking in the mountains far from civilization when the storm swept in. The wind howled like a living thing, and the snow came down so heavily that I could barely see my own hands in front of me. The trail was gone, buried under layers of snow, and I had no idea which direction would lead me back to safety. I pulled my jacket tighter, every breath forming a cloud of mist in the icy air. My legs felt heavy, and my fingers were already numb despite my gloves. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. If I didn't find shelter soon, I wouldn't survive the night. Then I saw it. Through the storm, faint but unmistakable, was a light. It flickered weakly, like the flame of a lantern, and it was moving. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the snow or my mind playing for games. But as I stared, the light grew brighter, bobbing gently as if someone were carrying it. Relief surged through me. Someone else was out here. Maybe they had a cabin, or knew the way back to the trailhead. I stumbled toward the light, the wind pushing against me like an invisible wall. The closer I got, the more distinct it became. It wasn't just a light, it was a lantern, an old-fashioned one with a metal frame and glass sides. But there was no one holding it. The lantern hung from a tall, crooked post planted in the middle of the snow. Its flame burned steadily, unaffected by the howling wind or the swirling snow. I stopped a few feet away, my breath catching in my throat. It didn't make sense. How could it burn in a storm like this? I stepped closer, my boots crunching in the snow. The lantern cast a faint glow on the ground, creating a small circle of warmth in the freezing night. I hesitated, my instincts warning me that something was wrong. But the cold was unbearable, and the thought of standing in that circle of light, even for a moment, was too tempting. I stepped into the light. The warmth was immediate, wrapping around me like a blanket. The wind seemed to die down, the blizzard's roar fading to a muffled whisper. For the first time in hours, I could feel my fingers and toes again. I closed my eyes, letting the warmth seep into my frozen body. But when I opened them, I wasn't alone. A figure stood just outside the circle of light. It was tall and thin, its body obscured by the swirling snow. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold, unblinking. My chest tightened as I took a step back, my brushing against the post. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. The figure didn't answer. It didn't move. It just stood there, motionless, watching me. I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. The warmth of the lantern's light suddenly felt suffocating, like it was trapping me instead of protecting me. I stepped out of the circle, my heart pounding. The storm hit me immediately, the wind screaming in my ears, and the snow stinging my skin. The figure was gone. I turned back to the lantern, but the light seemed dimmer now, its glow barely piercing the darkness. My first instinct was to run, to get as far away from it as possible. But the storm was too strong, and I knew I wouldn't last long without its warmth. I had no choice. I had to stay close. The snow around the lantern was disturbed now, marked with faint, dragging tracks. Weren't mine. They led away from the lantern, deeper into the blizzard, and I couldn't help but feel like they were inviting me to follow. I didn't want to, but something about those tracks pulled at me, invisible force tugging at the edges of my mind. Before I realized what I was doing, I was walking again, following the tracks into the storm. The lantern's light grew faint behind me, but the tracks were clear, cutting through the snow like a path. The forest loomed ahead, the trees dark and twisted against the white. The tracks led straight into the woods, their strange dragging pattern becoming more erratic the deeper I went. My breath came in shallow gasps, my heart racing with every step. Then the tracks stopped. In the middle of the forest, surrounded by towering trees, they just ended. The snow around me was untouched, the storm quieting to an eerie stillness. I turned in a slow circle, searching for any sign of movement, but the woods were empty. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, barely audible over the wind. It was a low, raspy whisper, coming from somewhere in the darkness. My chest tightened as I strained to hear, my ears ringing with the effort. The whisper grew louder, more distinct, and I realized it wasn't just one voice, it was many. They were calling my name. I stumbled back, my breath hitching in my throat. The whispers surrounded me, coming from every direction, and I felt the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on me. My legs felt heavy, my body rooted to the spot as the voices grew louder, more desperate. And then I saw them. Figures emerged from the darkness, their shapes barely visible in the dim light. They were thin and twisted, their limbs unnaturally long, their faces shrouded in shadow. They moved slowly, deliberately, their bodies swaying with each step. I turned and ran. The storm roared back to life, the wind clawing at my clothes and the snow blinding me. My lungs burned as I stumbled through the trees, the whispers following me, growing louder with every step. The figures were close now, their twisted shapes flickering in and out of the shadows. I broke through the edge of the forest and saw the lantern's light ahead. It was brighter now, blazing like a beacon in the storm. I sprinted toward it, my legs threatening to give out with every step. The whispers were deafening, the figures almost upon me. I reached the lantern and collapsed into its circle of light. The warmth hit me like a wave, and the whispers stopped. The figures were gone, the storm silent once more. But I wasn't safe. The tracks leading away from the lantern were back, and this time, they were mine. They wound into the forest, their strange, dragging pattern matching the ones I had followed. And as I looked closer, I realized something else. The figures weren't gone. They were standing at the edge of the light, waiting for me to step outside. The wind howled like a living thing, a mournful wail that cut through the endless white surrounding me. Snowflakes whipped against my face, sharp and stinging like tiny shards of glass. I had been walking for what felt like hours, though time had lost all meaning in the storm. The world was a swirling blur of white, and every direction looked the same. My legs were heavy, each step more difficult than the last, but I couldn't stop. The fear of freezing to death kept me moving. It started as a whisper, faint and almost swallowed by the wind. At first, I thought it was nothing, just the storm playing tricks on my ears, but then I heard it again. My name, clear, distinct, and impossibly close. I froze, heart pounding. The sound hadn't come from in front of me or behind me, it felt like it was all around me, surrounding me. My breath came in short, panicked bursts, visible as clouds, but in the freezing air. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew better. No, storm could whisper my name like that. I turned, hoping to see someone, anyone. The snow swirled so thickly that I could barely see it a few feet ahead. There was no one. My voice trembled as I called out, asking if anyone was there. The storm swallowed my words, leaving only an eerie silence behind. And then it came again, louder this time. My name, drawn out, slow, almost playful. I started walking faster, not caring about the direction anymore. My only thought was to get away from whatever was out there. But the snow was relentless, and soon, my legs felt like lead. Every step became harder as the cold seeped deeper into my bones. The whisper came again, closer now, almost like it was right next to my ear. My legs gave out, and I fell to my knees in the snow. My name echoed through the storm, repeated over and over, as if something unseen was circling me. I couldn't see anything, but I felt Ida presence, heavy and suffocating. It felt like a pair of invisible eyes were watching me, unblinking and predatory. I forced myself to stand, using every ounce of strength I had left. My breath was shallow, each exhale visible in the freezing air. The whispers didn't stop, louder, more insistent, each time coming from a different direction. I started running, blind to where I was going. The snow made it nearly impossible to move, but adrenaline pushed me forward. I stumbled over something buried in the snow and landed hard on the ground. Dazed, I pushed myself up and turned to see what had tripped me. At first, I thought it was a rock, but as I brushed away the snow, my heart stopped. It was a hand, pale and frozen, sticking out from the icy ground. I scrambled back, unable to look away. The hand didn't move, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was somehow alive. The whispers stopped, replaced by an unbearable silence. The wind died down, leaving only the sound of my ragged breathing. Then, the silence broke. A voice a whisper, but something deeper and colder spoke my name. It wasn't human. The sound was low and guttural, echoing as if it came from deep within the earth. I looked around wildly, but the snow had closed in again, shrouding everything in white. Something moved in the storm, a shadow, tall and thin, barely visible through the snow. It was watching me. I could feel its gaze, piercing and unrelenting. The shadow didn't move closer, but it didn't retreat either. It just stood there, waiting. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my body refused to obey. The shadow began to shift, stretching and twisting unnaturally, like smoke caught in a gust of wind. My name came again, louder this time, spoken in a voice that sounded like it was made of ice and stone. I finally broke free from my paralysis and ran. The snow made every step a struggle, but I didn't dare look back. I could hear it following me, the crunch of snow under invisible footsteps. The storm seemed alive, guiding me in circles, trapping me in its frozen embrace. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually, I stumbled upon an old cabin. It was small and half buried in the snow, but it looked solid. Desperate for shelter, I forced the door open and slammed. It shut behind me. The inside was dark and cold, but it was being out in the storm. I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. No whispers, no footsteps, no voice. Just the sound of the wind outside. I thought I was safe, but then I heard it. A faint scratching sound, coming from somewhere inside the cabin. My blood ran cold. The room was pitch black, and I couldn't see a thing. I fumbled for my phone, using its dim light to scan the room. It was empty, just an old table and a broken chair. The scratching stopped. I turned back to the door, and that's when I saw it. In the frost-covered window, there was a face, pale, hollow, and inhuman. Its eyes were black void, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. I screamed, stumbling back, but the face didn't move. It just stared at me, unblinking. The whispers returned, louder than ever, echoing all around me. My name was repeated over and over, each time in a different voice, some familiar, some completely alien. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The voices were inside my head. The door behind me rattled violently, as if something was trying to force its way in. I backed into a corner, trembling. The face in the window faded, replaced by darkness, but I knew it wasn't gone. It was inside the cabin now, with me. The last thing I remember is the sound of my name, spoken in a voice that was mine but not mine. It was close, right next to my ear, and then everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying in the snow, miles from the cabin. The storm was gone, and the sun was rising, but the cold was still inside me, and no matter how far I walked, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was following me. I can still hear the whispers, and distant, whenever I am alone. The blizzard may have passed, but I know it's not over. It's never over. The snow fell softly at first, covering the ground in a perfect, untouched blanket of white. The forest was silent except for the crunch of my boots as I walked. The stillness was comforting, like the world was holding its breath. I was alone, far from the noise of everyday life. I thought it would be peaceful. Then I saw the blood. At first, it was just a small streak against the snow, a single drop, bright red and fresh, impossible to miss against the pale ground. I stopped, staring at it. My mind raced with possibilities. An animal, maybe? A predator and its prey? I wasn't sure. But something about it felt wrong. I kept walking, telling myself I was imagining things. But the blood didn't stop. It turned into a trail, each drop leading to the next. The sight of it was jarring against the pristine snow, like a wound in the landscape. It wasn't smeared or scattered like you'd expect from an injured animal. It was deliberate, almost like it had been placed there. My curiosity got the better of me. I told myself I would follow it for a little while, just to see where it led. Maybe there was an injured animal I could help. That's what I told myself anyway. Deep down, I wasn't sure I believed it. The further I followed, the quieter the forest became. The usual sounds birds, the rustling of branches, the distant hum of the wind were gone. The only sound was breathing and the crunch of snow underfoot. It felt like I was the only living thing in the world. The trail grew heavier. At first, it was just drops, but now there were smears and splatters, as if something had been dragged through the snow. My stomach tightened. The logical part of my brain told me to turn around and leave. Whatever was bleeding, whatever was making this trail, it wasn't something I wanted to find. But my feet kept moving forward, as if they had a will of their own. The trees grew thicker, their dark branches stretching overhead like claws. The trail led me deeper into the forest, further than I'd ever been. The air felt colder here, heavy and suffocating. The blood was fresher now, the red brighter against the snow. It wasn't just a trail anymore, it was a path, leading somewhere specific. I don't know when I first noticed the smell. It was faint at first, really noticeable. But as I walked, it grew stronger, metallic, and sharp, mixed with something rotten. It hit me in waves, making my stomach churn. The snow beneath the blood started to look disturbed, like something heavy had passed through, crushing it down. I wanted to turn back. I told myself I would, but I didn't. The trail had a pull, something I couldn't explain. It felt like it was drawing me in, whispering to me. Even though I couldn't hear a sound, my hands were trembling, and I could feel the cold sinking into my bones. But I kept going. The trees opened up into a small clearing. At the center was a mound of snow, piled unnaturally high. The blood led straight to it, pooling at the base. My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped closer. The smell was overwhelming now, making my eyes water. I stood there, staring at the mound, frozen in place. Something was buried beneath the snow. I didn't want to know what it was, but my body moved on its own. My gloved hands reached out, brushing away the snow. The blood soaked into the ice, staining it dark red. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. It didn't make sense. The shapes were wrong, twisted and broken in ways that shouldn't be possible. It took me a moment to realize they were bones, human bones. The skeleton was incomplete, the ribs shattered, the skull caved in. Snow around it was soaked with blood, far more than should have been possible. My stomach turned, and I stumbled back, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I tried to tell myself it wasn't real, that my eyes were playing tricks on me, but it was real, too real. I turned to run, but as I did, I saw them. Footprints, leading away from the mound. They weren't mine. They were larger, heavier, and they pressed deep into the snow. They hadn't been there when I arrived. My heart sank as I realized the prints were fresh, the edges sharp and untouched by the falling snow. Something had been here, something that had made that pile, and it was still close. The forest felt alive now, watching me, closing in around me. Every shadow between the trees seemed to move. Every gust of wind carried a sound that might have been breathing. The footprints led away from the mound, deeper into the woods, but I couldn't follow them. I couldn't bring myself to. Instead, I ran. My feet slipped on the blood-soaked snow. My lungs burned from the freezing air, but I didn't stop. I didn't dare look back. I knew if I did, I'd see it. Whatever it was, whatever had made that trail, whatever had been watching me from the trees. The forest seemed endless, and I wasn't sure if I was going the right way. The snow fell harder, blurring my vision. My mind raced with thoughts of what I'd seen, of what might be following me. The smell of blood was still in my nose, so strong that it felt like it had seeped in my skin. When I finally broke through the trees and into the open, I collapsed in the snow. The forest loomed behind me, dark and silent, as if it had swallowed the trail completely. I wanted to believe it was over, that I was safe, but as I lay there, catching my breath, I heard it. A low, guttural sound, like a growl, coming from the trees. I didn't wait to see what it was. I forced myself up and ran, not stopping until I reached the safety of my car. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something had followed me. The drive home was a blur, my hands trembling on the wheel. I locked every door, every window, and sat in the dark, trying to convince myself it was over. But I couldn't, because when I looked down, I saw it. A single bloody footprint on the floor. It wasn't mine. The cold was unbearable. It sank into my bones, stealing the warmth from my body no matter how many layers I wore. The snow crunched beneath my boots as I walked along the frozen trail, my breath clouding in front of me with every exhale. The air was still, almost too still, as if the world itself had frozen solid. At first, I barely noticed it. My breath, curling in the icy air, seemed strange. It wasn't just the usual mist of condensation. It had shapes, faint outlines that dissipated quickly. I stopped walking and stared, blowing out a puff of air. It happened again. The vapor twisted and stretched, forming something almost recognizable before vanishing into the cold. I thought I was imagining things. Maybe the frost was playing tricks on me, or my tired mind was conjuring shapes where there were none. I shook my head, laughed nervously, and kept walking. But the farther I went, the stranger it became. The shapes in my breath grew clearer. They weren't random anymore. They looked like faces, distorted, frozen in expressions of pain and terror. Every exhale brought a new one, each more vivid than the last. My chest tightened, and I tried to tell myself it wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But it was. I stopped again, staring as the mist from my mouth formed a face, its eyes wide and hollow, its mouth open in a silent scream. The face lingered longer this time, hanging in the air before dissolving. I staggered back, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. I tried to breathe slower, thinking it might stop, but it didn't. The faces kept coming, twisting and writhing in the air like they were alive. The silence around me grew oppressive. The forest, once full, now felt like it was closing in. The trees loomed taller, their branches clawing at the sky. I felt like I was being watched, though I couldn't see anything in the endless white. My breath came faster, and the faces came faster too. They didn't just form and fade anymore, they moved, their mouths opening and closing as if they were trying to speak. A sound broke the stillness, a faint whisper, carried on the wind. It was so soft I wasn't sure I'd heard it at first. But then it came again, clearer this time. My name. My heart dropped. I spun around, searching for the source. But there was no one there. Only the snow and the trees and the endless cold. I wanted to run, but my legs felt rooted in place. My breath came in ragged bursts, and with each exhale, the faces grew more frantic. Their screams, once silent, began to fill my ears. It wasn't just in my mind, I could hear them now, faint and distant, but unmistakable. They were crying out, pleading, as if they were in pain. The whispers grew louder, mingling with the screams. My name echoed through the forest, repeated by voices that didn't belong to anyone I knew. Some were deep and guttural, others high and shrill, but all of them sounded wrong, like they came from something that wasn't human. I finally forced my legs to move, stumbling forward on the trail. The snow seemed deeper now, pulling at my boots like it didn't want me to leave. The air grew colder with every step, and the faces in my breath became clearer, more detailed. I could see their features, now their sunken eyes, their twisted mouths, their expressions of agony. Some of them looked familiar, though I couldn't place where I'd seen them before. The whispers turned into laughter, cold, cruel laughter that seemed to come from all around me. It echoed through the forest, blending with the screams until I couldn't tell one from the other. My breath came faster, forming a swirling mass of faces that writhed and screamed and begged. I felt like I was suffocating, the air around me too thick with their presence. I tripped and fell into the snow, the cold biting into my hands and knees. The whispers stopped, suddenly, replaced by a deafening silence. The faces in my breath were gone, but the air felt heavier now, charged with something unseen. I looked up and froze. Standing in the trees was a figure, tall, thin, and shadowy. It seemed to blend with the darkness of the forest. Its face was pale and featureless, like a blank canvas, but I could feel its gaze on me. It didn't move, but its presence was suffocating. The laughter started again, louder now, coming from the figure even though it had no mouth. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not caring where the trail led. The snow clung to me, pulling me back with every step, but I didn't stop. The faces returned, screaming in my breath, their cries growing louder and more desperate. I felt like I was being chased, though I didn't dare look back. The trees blurred around me, the cold cutting into my lungs like knives. The laughter followed me, echoing in my ears no matter how far I ran. My breath clouded the air, filling it with faces that twisted and melted into one another. They weren't just screaming anymore. They were shouting words, though I couldn't understand them. It sounded like a warning, or maybe a plea. I saw a light in the distance, faint but unmistakable. It looked like a cabin, its windows glowing softly in the darkness. I ran toward it, the snow giving way beneath me with every step. The laughter grew fainter as I approached, and for a moment, I thought I might be safe. I reached the cabin and threw the door open, collapsing inside. The warmth hit me like a wave, and I slammed the door shut behind me. My breath came in gasps, filling the air with faces that quickly faded in the heat. The screams stopped, replaced by a heavy silence. The cabin was empty, but it felt wrong. The walls were lined with mirrors, all of them fogged with condensation. As I stepped forward, the fog cleared, revealing my reflection. But it wasn't my reflection. The face staring back at me was one of the faces from my breath, its eyes hollow and filled with despair. The laughter returned, louder than ever, coming from the mirrors. The faces began to appear in them, one by one, their mouths opening in unison. I backed away, but the walls seemed to close in, the mirrors warping and stretching toward me. The last thing I remember is my own face in the glass, twisting into a scream that wasn't mine. When I woke up, I was back on the trail, the snow untouched around me. The forest was silent, again, and the faces were gone. But the cold was still inside, deeper than before. And when I exhaled, I saw it, a faint outline, barely there, of a face in my breath. It was smiling. The first time I heard the footsteps, I thought it was my imagination. It was late. The air was sharp, with cold, and the snow beneath my boots crunched with each step. I had taken a familiar path, through the woods, one I had walked many times before. The trees stretched high above me, their branches bare and reaching, and the snow-covered ground glowed faintly in the moonlight. At first, the sound was faint, a soft crunch, perfectly timed with my own steps. I stopped, walking, turning to look behind me. Nothing but a long, unbroken trail of my footprints stretched, looking back the way I had come. The forest was still, almost unnaturally quiet. The only sound was the faint whisper of the wind through the trees. I shook my head and kept walking. I told myself it was nothing, maybe the echo of my own steps bouncing off the trees. But the sound came again, clearer this time. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and just a few paces behind me. I stopped again, my breath visible in the freezing air. This time, I didn't just look behind me. I scanned the snow for signs of another person. There was nothing. No footprints, no disturbance. In the smooth blanket of white, my trail was the only one, leading away into the woods. My heart began to pound. I tried to convince myself that it had to be an animal, though I couldn't think of one that would mimic the sound of footsteps so perfectly. I picked up my pace, walking, faster now, each step echoing loudly in the silence. But the sound followed me, matching my setter, rhythm exactly. It felt like a game. No matter how quickly or slowly I moved, the steps mirrored mine. Always the same distance behind, always perfectly in time. My skin prickled, and a cold sweat started to form despite the freezing air. I wanted to run, but I didn't. Something about the footsteps felt wrong, like if I ran, it would chase me. I told myself to stay calm. The trail wasn't far, and once I was back on it, I could make my way home. But the forest felt endless, the trees crowding closer together as I walked. The sound of the footsteps grew louder, heavier, as if whoever or whatever was following me was drawing closer. I stopped again, spinning around quickly, hoping to catch something, anything. The forest behind me was empty, the snow undisturbed. But the sound didn't stop. For a moment it continued, 1, 2, 3 more steps before falling silent. My stomach turned, and I felt a wave of nausea. Something was there. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it watching me. The air felt heavier, colder, like it was pressing down on me. My breath came faster, clouding the air in front of me. I forced myself to move, my legs trembling as I walked. The footsteps started again, this time slightly out of sync with mine. They were louder now, closer, but when I turned to look, there was still nothing there. No tracks, no shadow, nothing. Panic began to set in. I was being followed by something that left no trace, something I couldn't see. My rational mind tried to find an explanation, but there wasn't one. I quickened my pace, practically jogging now, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. The footsteps followed. Faster, heavier, closer. The sound began to change. It wasn't just the crunch of snow anymore. It was deeper, almost wet, like something heavy sinking into the ground. My ears strained to pinpoint the noise, but it seemed to come from all around me, echoing in the stillness. I broke into a run, no longer caring about staying calm. The forest blurred around me, the trees a maze of dark shapes. My lungs burned, and my legs screamed in protest, but I didn't stop. The footsteps thundered behind me, impossibly loud, as if whatever was following me was right on my heels. I stumbled, falling hard into the snow. The cold bit into my hands and knees, but I scrambled to my feet, heart racing. I looked around wildly, expecting to see something, but the forest was empty. The sound of the footsteps was gone. The silence was worse. It pressed against me, suffocating, amplifying the sound of my own ragged breathing. I turned in circles, searching the trees. For a moment, I thought I was safe, that maybe I had outrun it. Then I saw it. Just ahead, where the moonlight hit the snow, was a shadow. It didn't belong to a tree or an animal. It was long and human-shaped, stretching toward me even though there was no one there to cast it. My blood ran cold. The shadow moved, shifting unnaturally, as if it were alive. It crept closer, inching forward across the snow. I backed away, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear the crunch of the snow beneath my feet. The shadow stopped, and for a moment, everything was still. Then the footsteps returned, louder than ever, pounding through the snow as if an invisible force was charging toward me. I turned and ran, blindly crashing through the trees. Branches clawed at my face and arms, the snow pulling at my legs, but I didn't care. I had to get away. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually, I burst out of the trees and onto the main trail. The forest opened up around me, the path stretching out toward the distant lights of my home. Footsteps stopped abruptly, and the silence returned. I didn't stop running until I reached my door. My hands shook so badly I could barely get the key into the lock. Once inside, I slammed the door shut and locked it, leaning against it as I tried to catch my breath. The house was dark and quiet, but I didn't feel safe. I checked the windows, pulling the curtains closed, and turned on every light. My reflection in the glass was pale and frightened, but behind it I saw nothing. No shadow, no figure, no tracks in the snow outside. But I could still hear it. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. The sound of footsteps circling the house. And when I held my breath, straining to listen, I realized they weren't fading away. They were getting closer. The snow was falling thick and fast, blanketing the ground in soft white layers. The world around me was silent, the usual sounds of the forest muffled by the storm. I pulled my scarf tighter around my face, trying to keep the cold from biting into my skin. My boots crunched against the snow as I walked along the narrow trail, the only path I knew that would lead back to the cabin. I had left earlier in the day to collect firewood, thinking it would be a quick trip, but the snowstorm rolled in faster than I expected, swallowing the sun and turning the sky gray. Forest felt different now, the trees looming like dark shadows against the endless white. I kept my head down, focusing on my footsteps and the trail ahead. It wasn't long before I noticed a strange sensation, like the weight of someone's gaze. It started as a faint prickling at the back of my neck, making me pause and glance over my shoulder. The snow fell so thickly that I couldn't see more than a few feet behind me. There was nothing there, only the trees and the swirling snow. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the storm and the eerie quiet. But the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it grew stronger. My steps quickened, boots sinking into the snow as I tried to shake off the unease. But no matter how far I walked, I couldn't escape the sense that I wasn't alone. Then I saw it. At first, it was nothing more than a faint shape in the distance, barely visible through the falling snow. A figure, standing still among the trees. My breath caught in my throat, and I stopped dead, in my tracks. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but the storm blurred the details. It was tall, unnaturally so, and its outline was sharp against the hazy background. I called out, my voice trembling as it echoed through the trees. "Hello? Is someone there?" No answer. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, its presence heavy and unnatural. My heart pounded in my chest, and my breath came in shallow bursts, clouding the air in front of me. I took a step back, then another, never taking my eyes off the shape. It still didn't move, but something about it felt wrong, like it wasn't supposed to be there. I turned and started walking faster, almost running, my heart hammering as I tried to put as much distance as I could between myself and whatever I had seen. The snow was coming down harder. Now, the wind picking up and howling through the trees. It felt like the forest was closing in around me, the trail disappearing under the fresh snowfall. The feeling of being watched didn't leave me. If anything, it grew stronger. I couldn't shake the image of the figure from my mind. It had no face, no features I could make out, but its presence was burned into my thoughts. It was like it had followed me, even though I hadn't looked back to check. I stumbled as the snow deepened, nearly falling before catching myself on a low branch. I glanced around, trying to get my bearings, but everything looked the same, just endless white and black silhouettes of trees. My chest tightened as I realized I didn't know if I was still on the trail. I had been so focused on getting away that I hadn't paid attention to where I was going. The sound of the wind changed, carrying with it something new, a faint noise, almost like a whisper. I stopped, holding my breath, straining to listen. It was so soft I could barely hear it, but it was there. It sounded like my name. Panic gripped me, and I started moving again, faster this time, ignoring the ache in my legs and the burning cold in my lungs. The whisper followed me, growing louder, though it still seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My name, over and over, in a voice that didn't belong to anyone I knew. I broke into a run, the snow dragging at my boots, slowing me down. The trees around me blurred into a dark wall, and the ground seemed to tilt beneath my feet. My breaths came in, ragged gasps, each exhale clouding the air in front of me. Sure, I could feel it now. Something behind me, close enough to touch. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help myself. I glanced back, and my blood turned to ice. The figure was there, closer this time, moving through the snow without leaving a single footprint. It was tall, its shape barely human, and its face was nothing but a smooth, pale void. The snow didn't touch it. It seemed to shift around the figure, as though it existed outside of the storm. I screamed, the sound raw and desperate, and pushed myself to run faster. My body screamed in protest, every muscle burning, but I didn't care. I had to get away. The cabin couldn't be far. No, it had to be close. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, and the figure seemed to glide through the snow, faster than it should have been able to move. It didn't run, didn't stumble, just floated toward me, with a terrible, unnatural grace. When I finally saw the cabin, I nearly collapsed with relief. It was just ahead, its windows glowing faintly in the storm. I sprinted the last stretch, my legs barely carrying me, and slammed into the door, fumbling with the latch. The whispers were all around me now, the sound echoing inside my skull. I threw the door open and stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind me. My body shook with adrenaline and exhaustion as I locked the door and pressed my back against it. The cabin was dark except for the faint glow of the fire in the hearth. The warmth hit me, but it didn't feel comforting. Something was wrong. The whispers had stopped, but the silence was worse. It was heavy, oppressive, pressing down on me like a weight. My breath came in shallow gasps, and as I exhaled, I saw it, the faintest outline of a face in the mist of my breath, staring back at me. Before I could react, a soft knock came at the door. It wasn't frantic, just a slow, deliberate tap. My heart stopped, and I froze, too scared to move. Another knock came, louder this time, followed by a third. I pressed myself harder against the door, tears streaming down my face as the air grew colder around me. The knock stopped, replaced by a voice on the other side. It was soft, almost gentle, but it wasn't human. It spoke my name. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I sat there in the dark, trembling, as the voice faded into the storm. When I finally dared to open the door, there was nothing there, just the falling snow, untouched and silent. But the feeling of being watched never left. It never does. The snowstorm came out of nowhere. One moment, the sky was clear, and the next was howling, carrying a wall of white that swallowed everything around me. I couldn't see the trail anymore, couldn't even tell which direction I had come from. My heart raced as I trudged through the snow, desperate to find some kind of shelter before the cold claimed me. That's when I saw it. A cabin, small and dark, nestled among the trees. It hadn't been there before I was sure of it. I had been hiking this area for days, and I hadn't seen any buildings marked on the map, but there it was, standing solid against the storm. The windows were black, and the door hung slightly ajar, swaying in the wind. I didn't have time to question it. The cold was biting into my skin, and the snow was coming down harder with every passing second. I stumbled toward the cabin, my legs heavy, and pushed the door open. Inside, it was warmer than I expected. The air smelled faintly of wood and something metallic, and a fire crackled weakly in the stone fireplace, as if someone had just been there. I called out, my voice trembling, but no one answered. The cabin was empty. It was small, just one room with a cot in the corner, a table, and a single chair. On the table sat a lantern and a book with a cracked leather cover. The walls were bare wood, the floor creaking beneath my boots. It felt old, abandoned, but at the same time, it didn't. The fire, the lantern, even the faint warmth, it all felt wrong. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. Outside, but in here, it was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that presses against your ears and makes you feel like you are being watched. I shook off the thought and moved toward the fireplace, holding my hands out to the weak flames. As the warmth seeped into my skin, I let out a shaky sigh of relief. I told myself I was safe. This was just a cabin, nothing more. But something about it felt off, like it didn't belong here. Couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting for me. I tried not to think about it as I sat down on the cot. My body ached, and my head throbbed from the cold, but the unease in my chest wouldn't let me rest. My eyes wandered to the book on the table. I didn't want to touch it, but curiosity got the better of me. The cover was cold under my fingers, and when I opened it, the pages were blank. All of them. I flipped through, my heartbeat quickening, as I realized there wasn't a single word written inside. Just empty, yellowed pages that smelled faintly of ash. I set the book down and looked around the cabin again. The shadows seemed darker now, deeper, like they were stretching toward me. The fire crackled, the sound sharp and unnatural, and I swore I heard something move behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the door, closed and locked, and the empty room. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. I told myself it was just my nerves, just the storm, and the strange cabin playing tricks on me. But when I glanced at the window, my breath caught in my throat. There was a face. It was faint, almost like it was pressed against the glass from the outside. But it was there, pale, hollow, with eyes that seemed to stare straight through me. I froze, unable to move or look away. The face didn't move either, it just stayed there, watching. I blinked, and it was gone. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and grabbed the lantern from the table. The light flickered as I turned toward the door, ready to leave. I didn't care about the storm anymore. I needed to get out of this cabin. But when I opened the door, the storm was gone. The snow had stopped falling, and the air was deathly still. The forest outside was black, the trees towering like silent sentinels. There were no stars, no moon, no sound, just an endless darkness that seemed to stretch forever. I stepped outside, the lantern's light barely piercing the gloom. The snow crunched under my boots, and I looked around, trying to find the trail. It wasn't there. The landscape was unfamiliar, the trees too close together, the air too heavy. It felt like the forest had shifted, like I was somewhere else entirely. Then I heard it. A low rumbling noise, like distant thunder, but it came from the trees. It grew, louder, closer, and I realized it wasn't thunder at all. It was a voice, deep and guttural, speaking in a language I didn't understand. The sound wrapped around me, vibrating in my chest, making my knees weak. I turned back toward the cabin, but the door was gone. The walls had shifted, the windows dark and empty. It wasn't the same cabin anymore, it was twisted, wrong. The wood warped, blackened like it had been burned. The fire inside was out, replaced by a chill that cut deeper than the storm ever had. The voice grew louder, and I felt the ground shift beneath me. Shadows moved between the trees, long and thin, stretching toward me. The lantern flickered, flame sputtering, as if it was being choked by the darkness. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, but I ran as fast as I could, the snow at my legs. The shadows followed, their movements unnatural and jerky, like puppets on strings. The voice was in my head now, whispering, laughing, calling my name. I tripped and fell, the lantern flying from my hand and extinguishing in the snow. The darkness closed in, and I felt the air grow colder, heavier, as if the forest itself was alive, breathing around me. I crawled forward, desperate to escape, but the shadows were everywhere. When I finally looked up, the cabin was in front of me again. But this time, the door was wide, it was open, and the fire inside burned brightly. I didn't want to go back, but the shadows pressed closer, forcing me toward it. I stumbled through the door, slamming it shut behind me. The fire crackled warmly, and the room looked normal again, like it had changed. But I knew better. I could feel the wrongness, the way the air seemed to hum with something unseen. The book was back on the table, open to a page that hadn't been there before. On it, in dark scrawled letters, were the words, "You can't leave. I don't know how long I've been here. The storm never comes back, but neither does the sun." The forest outside is endless, and the cabin, it changes. Sometimes the door won't open. Sometimes the windows show things that aren't there. And at night, I hear the voice, whispering from the shadows, reminding me that this place wasn't on any map and I'll never find my way out. The snowstorm had been relentless for hours, the wind howling, and the air so cold it felt like it could freeze my lungs. I had been hiking in the forest, trying to reach the cabin before nightfall, but the storm hit harder than I'd expected. The trail I was following had disappeared under the heavy snow, leaving me lost in a sea of white. Every direction looked the same: trees, snow, and the swirling wind that seemed to mock my every step. I tried not to panic. I told myself I would find my way back. Then, through the haze of falling snow, I saw something strange. A path. It wasn't like the rough hiking trails I'd been walking on. This was smooth, unnaturally so, as if the ground had been polished to glass. It shimmered faintly in the weak light, cutting a perfect line through the forest. There were no footprints on it, no sign that anyone had been there before me. The sight of it made me stop. I should have been relieved to find something resembling a road, but instead, unease crept into my chest. There was something wrong about the path, something I couldn't put into words. But as the wind grew colder and the snow fell harder, I realized I didn't have a choice. It was the only thing that seemed to lead somewhere, and I couldn't stay in the storm. I stepped onto the frozen path, my boots slipping slightly on its icy surface. The cold felt sharper, here, biting into my skin like needles. The trees on either side of the path seemed taller, darker, their branches tangled together to block out what little light remained. I walked slowly at first, my eyes darting around the forest, looking for anyone. The world was silent except for the crunch of my boots and the faint whistle of the wind. My breath came in short puffs, visible in the freezing air, and every exhale seemed louder than it should have been. The path stretched on endlessly, perfectly straight, with no signs of curves or bends. It was like walking on a frozen river, smooth and cold. But there was no water, no ice cracks, just a solid surface that glowed faintly under the snow. I kept walking, hoping to see a cabin, a clearing, anything that could guide me back to safety. But there was nothing, just more trees, more snow, and the endless, frozen path. I don't know how long I walked. Minutes felt like hours, and the cold was sinking deeper into my bones. My legs grew heavy, each step harder than the last. The forest around me seemed to change as I walked. The trees grew closer together, their trunks twisted and blackened, their branches clawing at the sky. The air felt thicker, heavier, as if the forest was closing in. Then I noticed the footprints. At first, I thought they were mine, but they were too far ahead, perfectly centered on the path. They were fresh, their edges sharp, as if someone had just walked there. I stopped, staring at them, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked back over my shoulder, expecting to see someone behind me, but the path was empty. The snow around it was untouched, pristine except for my own trail. The wind howled louder, carrying a faint sound with it. It was so soft I almost missed it, a distant whisper, like someone calling my name. My stomach twisted, and I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, just my mind playing tricks. But the foot ahead of me seemed to move, appearing farther down the path as if someone was walking ahead, just out of sight. I called out, my voice cracking in the stillness. "Is someone there?" No answer, only the wind and the sound of my breathing. I didn't want to follow the footprints, but there was nowhere else to go. The forest on either side of the path was dark and unwelcoming, the trees packed too tightly to navigate. I kept walking, my steps slower now, my eyes fixed on the trail ahead. The footway stayed just ahead, as if teasing me, leading me deeper into the forest. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, though I still couldn't make out the words. They were coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing in my head. The trees seemed to move in my peripheral vision, their shadows stretching and shifting. But whenever I turned to look, they were still. I wanted to stop, to turn back, but when I looked over my shoulder, the path behind me was gone. The forest had swallowed it, leaving only an unbroken expanse of snow. Panic clawed at my chest as I realized I had no choice but to keep going. The path began to change. The smooth surface grew darker, its faint glow fading. The air felt colder, heavy with the metallic tang of frost. The footprints ahead disappeared, but the whispers didn't stop. They were louder now, clearer, and I could finally understand what they were saying. They were warning me. "Turn back," they hissed, their voices overlapping, desperate. "You don't belong here. Leave, before it's too late." I wanted to listen, but there was nowhere to go. The path narrowed, the trees on either side, pressing closer until their branches arched overhead, forming a tunnel of twisted wood. The darkness deepened, and the faint light from the snow barely reached me now. Then I saw it. At the end of the path, just beyond the tunnel, was a figure. It stood perfectly still, its silhouette stark against the faint glow of the snow. It was tall, too tall, its limbs unnaturally long and thin. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me, unblinking and cold. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I couldn't move. The whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. The figure didn't move, but the air around it seemed to shimmer, as if the world itself was bending around it. I stepped back, my boots slipping on the ice, but there was nowhere to go. The forest behind me was gone, replaced by an endless black void. The path beneath me cracked, spiderweb fractures spreading across its surface, and the figure took a single step forward. The silence shattered, replaced by a low, guttural sound that vibrated through my chest. The figure moved closer, its steps slow and deliberate, its presence suffocating. My legs refused to move, my body frozen in place as it loomed over me. I closed my eyes, bracing for the end, but when I opened them, the figure was gone. The path was gone. The forest was gone. I was standing in the middle of an endless white expanse, the snow falling softly around me. There was no sound, no trees, no footprints, just me in the cold, empty void. I don't know how long I stood there, waiting for something to happen. I don't know if I'll ever leave. The whispers still come sometimes, faint and distant, telling me to turn back. But here is nowhere to go. The night was quiet, too quiet. I had always hated the silence of the countryside. It wasn't the kind of peaceful silence people romanticize about. It was heavy, pressing down on me, making every creak of the floorboards and every rustle of the wind outside feel sharper, louder. Small cabin I'd rented felt safe during the day, but at night, it seemed to shrink, the darkness pressing in from every direction. I had been sitting in the living room, staring at the faint glow of the fire, when I heard it. A voice, faint at first, carried by the wind. At first, I thought it was my imagination. I had been alone for a few days, and the isolation was starting to wear on me. I brushed it off as the sound of the wind, slipping through the cracks in the old walls. But then I heard it again, clearer this time. My name. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't just any voice, it was mine. The exact tone, the same inflection I'd used my whole life. I shook my head, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was a trick of the wind, an echo, something logical I could explain away. But deep down, I knew. Better. The voice came again, louder this time. "Come here." My skin prickled. It was coming from outside, near the edge of the woods that surrounded the cabin. I couldn't see anything through the window, just the endless blackness of the forest. I told myself not to go. I told myself it wasn't safe. But curiosity, or maybe something stronger, pulled me to my feet. I grabbed a flashlight and wrapped a coat around before stepping out into the cold. The air was sharp, the kind of cold that bites into your skin and settles in your chest. The flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, revealing only snow-covered ground and trees stretching into the night. I stood there, my heart pounding in my ears, waiting to hear the voice. Again, and then it came, this way. The voice sounded so close, but I couldn't see anything. The forest felt alive, every shadow shifting, every branch rustling as if it were hiding something. I called out, my own voice, trembling. No answer, just silence. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My breath clouded, in the freezing air as I stepped off the porch, the snow crunching under my boots. I moved toward the edge of the woods, my flashlight sweeping the trees. The voice called again, softer, now but insistent. Come closer. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to go back to the safety of the cabin. But the voice was mine. It sounded so familiar, so natural, like it had to be coming from me. That made no sense, but nothing about this felt normal. I took a step into the woods, then another. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The snow muffled my footsteps, making the silence even more unnerving. The flashlight flickered, and my stomach twisted with fear. I banged it against my hand, willing it to stay on. Keep going, the voice urged. It was getting harder to breathe. The air felt heavier, thicker, as if the forest itself was pressing down on me. I turned in circles, shining the flashlight in every direction, but all I saw were endless trees. The voice was coming from everywhere now, echoing, surrounding me. Come closer. My legs felt weak, but I couldn't stop. I didn't know if I was following the voice, or if it was following me. I stumbled through the snow, branches snagging at my coat, the flashlight barely cutting through the darkness. The voice grew louder, more urgent, but it was wrong now. Distorted, like my voice, but twisted, stretched, as if it was being pulled apart. Then I saw it. A figure stood just ahead, half hidden among the trees. It looked like me, the same height, the same build, even the same coat. My breath caught in my throat as the flashlight flickered again, illuminating its face. It was my face, but something was wrong. Its eyes were hollow, empty sockets that seemed to stare right through me. Its mouth was twisted into a grin that didn't belong on my face. Too wide, too sharp. It tilted its head, watching me, its movements jerky and unnatural. Come closer, it said, the voice coming from its unmoving mouth. I stumbled back, my flashlight slipping from my hand and plunging the forest into darkness. Panic surged through me as I scrambled to pick it up, the beam flickering weakly as I pointed it back toward the figure. It was gone. The silence was deafening now, the air so thick it felt like I was drowning. I turned and ran, my feet slipping on the snow, my heart hammering in my chest. Branches clawed at me, the forest closing in as if it didn't want to let me go. The voice followed me, growing louder, more desperate. Don't run. Come back. Come closer. It wasn't just one voice anymore, it was many, all of them mine, overlapping and echoing in the darkness. I felt like I was being pulled in every direction, the voices tugging at my mind, trying to drag me back to that thing in the woods. I burst out of the trees and into the clearing around the cabin, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands shook as I locked it, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The cabin felt too small, too fragile, like the walls couldn't keep out whatever was out there. The voices stopped. The silence returned, but it wasn't comforting. It was heavy, oppressive, like the calm before a storm. I sat in the dark, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. And then I heard it. A knock. It was soft, almost polite, but it sent a jolt of terror through me. I didn't move, didn't even breathe, as the knock came again, louder this time. Let me in, the voice said. It was my voice, perfectly mimicked, coming from the other side of the door. I stayed frozen, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run, to hide, to do something. But I couldn't. The voice came again, softer now, almost pleading. You can't leave me out here. The doorknob rattled, and I bit back a scream. The voice shifted, growing darker, deeper, the words twisting into something guttural and wrong. Let me in. The knocking stopped. The silence stretched on, so heavy it felt like the air had turned solid. I stayed there, unmoving, staring at the door until the first light of dawn crept through the window. When I finally opened the door, there was nothing outside. No tracks in the snow, no sign of anyone. But I know it wasn't a dream. I can still hear the voice sometimes, faint and distant, calling my name in my own voice. It's waiting for me. The snowstorm started just as I was leaving the small village. The locals had warned me not to travel so late in the day, but I didn't listen. I thought I could make it back to the cabin before nightfall. The trail was familiar, and I had walked it dozens of times before, but the snow came fast, turning the world around me into a blur of white. I wrapped my coat tighter around me and kept walking, the wind howling in my ears. The trees loomed on either side of the trail, their branches heavy with snow. It felt like the forest was closing in, the shadows stretching longer as the daylight faded. My footsteps were the only sound, crunching through the deep snow. At first I didn't notice it. The feeling crept up slowly, a prickle on the back of my neck, a sense that I wasn't alone. I stopped and turned, looking back down the trail. Nothing, just the swirling snow and the faint outline of my footprints disappearing behind me. I shook off the feeling and kept walking, telling myself it was just the storm playing tricks on me. But the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it grew stronger. I glanced back again and froze. There, in the distance, was a figure. It stood on the trail, pale and motionless, barely visible through the falling snow. My heart skipped a beat as I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It looked like a person, but something about it was wrong. The shape was too still, too perfect, like it wasn't made of flesh and blood. I called out, my voice trembling. "Hello, who's there?" The figure didn't move. It just stood there, silent and unmoving. The snow blurred its edges, making it look like it was part of the storm. A strange, icy dread crept into my chest. I turned, started walking faster, my boots crunching louder in the snow. Every few steps I glanced back. The figure didn't seem to be following me, but it was always there, the same distance behind. No matter how far I walked, it stayed the same. It wasn't possible. I should have been leaving it behind, but it never got smaller or farther away. The forest grew darker as the storm thickened. The trail I had followed so many times seemed to stretch endlessly, the trees all looking the same. My legs ached, and my breath came in sharp, freezing bursts, but I didn't stop. The figure was still there, silent and waiting. Then, as I glanced back again, I saw it move. It was subtle, a slight shift, like it had leaned forward. My stomach turned, and I broke into a run. The snow was deep, making every step a struggle, but adrenaline pushed me forward. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I just needed to get away. The wind howled louder, drowning out the sound of my footsteps. My chest burned, and my lungs felt like they were filled with ice. I risked another glance behind me and nearly screamed. The figure was closer now, much closer. Its outline was clearer, and I could see its shape more distinctly. It was tall, its body made entirely of snow, its limbs too long and thin, its head tilted slightly, as if it were watching me. The blank, fearless face was the worst part, smooth and pale, with no eyes, no mouth, nothing human. I stumbled, falling to my knees in the snow. The cold bit into my skin as I scrambled to get back. Up, my hands shaking. The figure didn't stop. It was moving now, slow and deliberate, gliding over the snow as if it didn't need to walk. I ran again, faster than before, ignoring the pain in my legs. My thoughts were a mess, panic, and fear swirling in my mind like the storm around me. I didn't know where I was going anymore. The trail had vanished, and the forest seemed endless. The figure followed, always the same distance behind, no matter how fast I ran. It didn't leave any footprints in the snow, its body blending perfectly with the storm. It didn't make a sound, but I could feel it, its presence heavy and suffocating. I spotted a small clearing up ahead, a faint glimmer of hope in the endless forest. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stumbled into it, looking around desperately for a way out. There was nothing, no sign of a road, no shelter, just more trees surrounding me. The figure stepped into the clearing, its movement smooth and unnatural. It stopped at the edge, its head tilting again, as if studying me. The snow fell harder, and the wind screamed through the trees, but all I could hear was the pounding of my heart. I shouted at it, my voice cracking. "What do you want? Leave me alone." It didn't respond. It didn't move. It just stood there, its featureless face staring at me. The longer I looked at it, the more wrong it seemed. The snow around it was darker, almost gray, and the air felt colder, sharper, as if it were draining the warmth from everything around it. I backed away, my legs trembling. I didn't know what to do. Running hadn't worked, and the figure showed no signs of stopping. I thought about hiding, but where? The forest offered no cover. Then, without warning, it raised one arm. The movement was slow, deliberate, as if it wanted me to see. The arm stretched unnaturally, long, its fingers sharp and pointed, like icicles. My breath hitched as I realized it wasn't pointing at me. It was pointing past me. I turned, my heart in my throat, and saw another figure standing in the trees behind me. This one was smaller, its shape more human, but it was just as pale, just as featureless. It stepped forward, the snow beneath it undisturbed, and stopped a few feet away. I was surrounded. Panic overtook me, and I fell to my knees in the snow. The two figures stood on either side of me, silent and unmoving, their blank faces turned toward me. The storm grew louder, the snow swirling around me like a living thing. I closed my eyes, tears freezing on my cheeks, and waited. For what? I didn't know. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, the cold sinking into my bones. When I finally opened my eyes, the figures were gone. The clearing was empty. The forest was silent. But the snow beneath me was different. Now no. Longer, smooth, and untouched. It was covered in footprints. My own. They formed a perfect circle around where I knelt. The wind whipped through the barren landscape, carrying tiny shards of ice that stung my face. The snow stretched endlessly in every direction, unbroken and untouched, as if no one had ever set foot here before. I had no idea how far I had wandered, or how long I had been walking. All I knew was that I needed to find shelter soon. I tightened my scarf around my face and trudged forward, my boots crunching in the snow. Cold was relentless, sinking deep into my bones no matter how many layers I wore. Every step felt heavier than the last, and the world around me seemed to blur into a shapeless void of white and gray. That's when I saw it. Something gleaming faintly in the snow ahead, catching the weak light like a shard of glass. I hesitated, my heart skipping a beat. Nothing should have been out here, not in this frozen wasteland. Yet there it was, glinting like a beacon. I approached slowly, the snow crunching loudly in the silence. When I got closer, I realized what it was. A key. It lay half buried in the snow, its surface coated in frost, but the intricate design was unmistakable. The metal was silvery, almost too bright against the dull white of the snow, and it was cold to the touch when I picked it up, colder than the air around me. I turned it over in my hands, examining it. The key was ornate, with strange, swirling patterns etched into the metal. It felt old, impossibly old, like it didn't belong to this world. There was no reason for it to be here, in the middle of nowhere. No tracks, no signs of anyone who might have dropped it. Just the key, waiting. A shiver ran down my spine, and it wasn't just from the cold. Something about the key felt wrong, but I couldn't leave it there. I didn't know why, but I felt like I had to take it with me, like it was meant for me to find. I slipped it into my pocket and kept walking, the cold biting harder now, as if the temperature had dropped even further. The wind grew stronger, and the snow swirled around me, making it harder to see. I felt the key's weight in my pocket, heavier than it should have been, as if it were pulling me down. The storm thickened, and I realized I had no idea where I was going anymore. The landscape looked the same in every direction, the endless snow broken only by the occasional twisted tree or jagged rock. I tried to retrace my steps, but the wind had already erased my footprints. I was completely, hopelessly lost. Then I heard it, a faint sound, carried by the wind. It wasn't the usual howl of the storm, it was something else. A low, melodic hum, almost like a voice. It was distant at first, barely audible, but as I stood there, straining to hear, it grew louder. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, surrounding me. I turned in circles, my heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Just the snow and the wind and the endless white. But the sound didn't stop. If anything, it grew closer, more insistent. It wasn't just a hum anymore, it was a whisper. Words I couldn't quite make out, but they sent a chill down my spine. My hand drifted to my pocket, gripping the key tightly. The whispers grew louder, clearer, and I could finally make out the words. Open the way. The voice was soft, almost gentle, but there was something beneath it, something darker. I didn't know what it meant or where it was coming from, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it had something to do with the key. I kept walking, trying to block out the voice, but it followed me, whispering in my ear, growing more urgent with every step. The key felt heavier now, almost burning against my hand, even through my glove. The patterns etched into the metal seemed to shift and twist under my fingers, like they were alive. The storm around me seemed to shift, the snow falling faster, the wind pushing against me as if trying to force me back. The whispers turned into a chorus, overlapping voices that all said the same thing. Open the way. I stumbled forward, desperate to escape the sound, and that's when I saw Ida door. It stood alone in the snow, tall and black, its surface covered in the same swirling patterns as the key. It wasn't attached to anything, no walls, no frame, just the door, standing impossibly upright, the middle of nowhere. My heart raced as I approached it. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now, urging me forward. The door seemed to hum with energy, the patterns glowing faintly in the dim light. My hands shook as I pulled the key from my pocket. I didn't want to do it. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to run as far as I could. But something stronger pulled me toward the door, something I couldn't resist. My hand moved on, its own, the key fitting perfectly into the lock. As I turned it, the whispers stopped. The silence was worse. It pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating, as the door swung open. Beyond it was nothing but darkness, an endless void that seemed to stretch forever. The air grew, colder, sharper, and I felt something staring back at me from the darkness. I tried to step back, but my feet wouldn't move. The darkness seemed to reach out, pulling at me, drawing me closer. My breath caught in my throat as I saw things shift within the void, something massive and formless, with eyes that glowed like embers. The whispers returned, but they weren't soft anymore. They were harsh, angry, a cacophony of voices screaming in my head. The thing in the darkness moved closer, its shape becoming clearer, more defined. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything I could understand. I dropped the key and turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing through the emptiness. The whispers stopped again, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then the snow began to fall again, heavier this time, erasing everything around me. The door was gone, the key nowhere to be found. I was alone, in the endless white, the storm closing in, the darkness pressing against the edges of my vision. But I wasn't alone. I could feel it, just out of sight, watching me, waiting, and I knew I had opened the way. The snowstorm started just as I was leaving the small village. The locals had warned me not to travel so late in the day, but I didn't listen. I thought I could make it back to the cabin before nightfall. The trail was familiar, and I had walked it dozens of times before. But the snow came fast, turning the world around me into a blur of white. I wrapped my coat tighter around me and kept walking, the wind howling in my ears. The trees loomed on either side of the trail, their branches heavy with snow. It felt like the forest was closing in, the shadows stretching longer as the daylight faded. My footsteps were the only sound, crunching through the deep snow. At first I didn't notice it. The feeling crept up slowly, a prickle on the back of my neck, a sense that I wasn't alone. I stopped and turned, looking back down the trail. Nothing, just the swirling snow and the faint outline of my footprints disappearing behind me. I shook off the feeling and kept walking, telling myself it was just the storm playing tricks on me. But the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it grew stronger. I glanced back again and froze. There, in the distance, was a figure. It stood on the trail, pale and motionless, barely visible through the falling snow. My heart skipped a beat as I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It looked like a person, but something about it was wrong. The shape was too still, too perfect, like it wasn't made of flesh and blood. I called out, my voice trembling. "Hello, who's there?" The figure didn't move. It just stood there, silent and unmoving. The snow blurred its edges, making it look like it was part of the storm. A strange, icy dread crept into my chest. I turned, started walking faster, my boots crunching louder in the snow. Every few steps, I glanced back. The figure didn't seem to be following me, but it was always there, the same distance behind. No matter how far I walked, it stayed the same. It wasn't possible. I should have been leaving it behind, but it never got smaller or farther away. The forest grew darker as the storm thickened. The trail I had followed so many times seemed to stretch endlessly, the trees all looking the same. My legs ached, and my breath came in sharp, freezing bursts, but I didn't stop. The figure was still there, silent and waiting. Then, as I glanced back again, I saw it move. It was subtle, a slight shift, like it had leaned forward. My stomach turned, and I broke into a run. The snow was deep, making every step a struggle, but adrenaline pushed me forward. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I just needed to get away. The wind howled louder, drowning out the sound of my footsteps. My chest burned, and my lungs felt like they were filled with ice. I risked another glance behind me and nearly screamed. The figure was closer now, much closer. Its outline was clearer, and I could see its shape more distinctly. It was tall, its body made entirely of snow, its limbs too long and thin, its head tilted slightly, as if it were watching me. The blank, fearless face was the worst part, smooth and pale, with no eyes, no mouth, nothing human. I stumbled, falling to my knees in the snow. The cold bit into my skin as I scrambled to get back. Up, my hands shaking. The figure didn't stop. It was moving now, slow and deliberate, gliding over the snow as if it didn't need to walk. I ran again, faster than before, ignoring the pain in my legs. My thoughts were a mess, panic, and fear swirling in my mind like the storm around me. I didn't know where I was going anymore. The trail had vanished, and the forest seemed endless. The figure followed, always the same distance behind, no matter how fast I ran. It didn't leave any footprints in the snow, its body blending perfectly with the storm. It didn't make a sound, but I could feel it, its presence heavy and suffocating. I wanted to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. My eyes stayed fixed on the ice as the shadows moved again, closer this time. They weren't random shapes, they were figures. Vague, human-like shapes, twisting and writhing beneath the surface. Their movements were unnatural, almost playful, as if they were dancing to the rhythm of the laughter. One of them stopped. It pressed against the underside of the ice, its face, or what I thought was a face, turning up toward me. Its features were distorted, its eyes empty, and its mouth stretched into an impossibly wide grin. My chest tightened as it tapped against the ice with long, skeletal fingers. The sound, sharp and deliberate. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, as more figures joined it. They pressed against the ice, their faces twisted and grinning, their fingers clawing at the surface. The laughter grew louder, deafening, as the ice began to creak and groan beneath my feet. I turned and ran, my boots slipping on the ice as I scrambled toward the shore. Followed me, echoing in my ears, the sound twisting into words I couldn't understand. The ice cracked behind me, sharp and splintering, and I didn't dare look back. When I reached solid ground, I collapsed into the snow, my lungs burning and my body trembling. I turned back toward the lake, expecting to see it shattered, the figures rising from the water. But the ice was still, perfect, smooth, as if nothing had happened. The laughter was gone, the shadows were gone. The lake was silent again, the oppressive quiet, settling over the landscape once more. but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the figures were still there, just beneath the surface, waiting. I didn't stay to find out. I ran as fast as I could, the cold biting into my skin, my breath coming in, ragged gasps. Even as I left the lake behind, I could still hear the faint echo of laughter, carried by the wind. I don't go near frozen lakes anymore. I can't, because every time I see one, I hear it again, the sound of laughter, distant and cold, calling to me from beneath the ice. And I know, deep down, that if I ever go back, they'll be waiting. The cabin was buried deep in the forest, surrounded by a blanket of snow that stretched endlessly in every direction. It was supposed to be a retreat, a place to clear my mind and escape the chaos of daily life. But the silence was oppressive, the cold biting deeper than I expected. At night, the shadows of the trees stretched long across the snow, and the wind howled like a living thing. The icicles were everywhere, hanging from the roof of the cabin, the branches of the trees, even the edges of the porch. They were sharp and glassy, catching light in strange, beautiful patterns. At first, I thought they were the one peaceful thing about this place. I even took pictures of a few, their surfaces shimmering with frost. But then I noticed something strange. One icicle, longer and thicker than the others, hung just outside the cabin's front window. It wasn't the size that unnerved me, was the way it seemed to bend slightly inward, as though it were leaning closer to the glass. At first, I thought the wind had shaped it that way, but the wind couldn't explain why it almost seemed to point directly at me when I sat on the couch near the window. I tried to ignore it, but every time I glanced at the window, the icicle caught my eye. There was something about its surfaces smooth, but not perfectly so. Tiny imperfections rippled through the ice, catching the light in ways that made it look like a face. At first, I thought it was a trick of the frost, but as the day went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that the face in the ice was clearer than before. It wasn't just a vague outline anymore. I could see eye shallow, empty, and unblinking staring back at me. The mouth was open, its edges jagged, as if frozen mid-scream. I stepped closer to the window, my breath fogging the glass. The closer I looked, the more detailed it seemed. The face wasn't human. Its features were sharp, alien, its expression twisted into something that looked like hunger. I pulled back, my stomach twisting with unease. It wasn't possible. Ice didn't just form like that. I tried to distract myself, burying my head in a book, but the image of the face burned in my mind. It was there every time I closed my eyes. I couldn't focus. I kept glancing at the window, expecting to see the face staring back at me, but the icicle hadn't moved. It hung there, perfectly, still, as if mocking me. Night fell quickly, and the cabin grew colder. The weak sunlight gave way to shadows, and the only light came from the flickering flames of the fireplace. I tried not to look at the window, but I couldn't help it. The icicle was still there, glinting faintly in the firelight. I froze. The face wasn't just clearer. No, it was different. The hollow eyes seemed deeper, the jagged mouth wider, the expression more twisted. It wasn't just a shape in the ice anymore. It felt alive. I stood and backed away from the window, my heart pounding. My breath came in short, visible bursts, fogging the air around me. I told myself it was impossible. Ice couldn't change like that. Was imagining things. The isolation was getting to me. But then it moved. I saw it clearly, the faintest twitch, like the face in the ice was shifting. The mouth seemed to curve upward, almost like a smile. My chest tightened, and I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the edge of the rug. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. The wind outside picked up, howling louder, and the window rattled in its frame. I stared at the icicle, waiting for it to move again, but it didn't. It just hung there, the face frozen in its eerie, twisted expression. I turned away, forcing myself to look anywhere but the window. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows on the walls, but the room didn't feel warm anymore. It felt cold, colder than it had all day. I grabbed my coat and went to bed, pulling the blankets tightly around me. But I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind against the walls made me jump. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed of ice, endless, jagged shards of it, each one holding a face, like the one in the icicle. They stared at me, their mouths moving silently, as if trying to speak. I woke up with a start, the sound of the wind screaming in my ears. I sat up, my breath clouding the air. The fire had gone out, and the room was pitch black. The wind howled outside, but beneath it, I thought I heard something else. A faint tapping, soft, rhythmic, like something tapping against the glass. My stomach dropped. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. I turned my head toward the window, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The icicle was gone. I stared at the empty space, my mind racing. It had been there earlier. I was sure of it. I told myself the wind must have knocked it down, but when I looked closer, I saw the ice around. Where it had hung was smooth and untouched. There was no trace of it ever being there. The tapping came again, louder this time. My breath hitched as I realized it wasn't coming from the window, it was coming from the door. I froze, my body trembling. The sound was steady, deliberate, like something was knocking, waiting to be let in. I stood slowly, my legs shaking, and crept toward the door. The cabin was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. The tapping stopped. For a moment, everything was silent. I held my breath, listening, but the only sound was the faint howl of the wind. I reached for the doorknob, my hand trembling, and pulled it open. There was nothing there, just the snow, falling softly, and the dark forest beyond. I stepped out, onto the porch, my breath fogging the air, and looked around. The silence was deafening, the snow muffling every sound. And then I saw it. The icicle was hanging from a tree just a few feet away, its surface glinting faintly in the moonlight. The face was still there, but now it was smiling a wide, terrible grin that seemed to stretch impossibly far. The hollow eyes stared at me, unblinking. I stumbled back into the cabin, slamming the door shut and locking it. My chest heaved as I pressed my back against the door, trying to calm my racing heart. The tapping started again, louder now, more insistent. This time it came from every window. The faces were watching me. They were everywhere. The sky above me was alive, glowing with waves of green and purple light that danced across the darkness. The aurora borealis had always fascinated me, and seeing it for the first time felt like stepping into another world. I was alone in the wilderness, miles from the nearest town, where the skies were untouched by city lights. It was just me, the snow-covered ground, and the swirling ribbons of color above. The lights seemed to pulse, shifting like they were alive, almost calling to me. I stood there for a long time, staring up in awe. The air was cold, biting at my face and hands, but I didn't care. There was something mesmerizing about the aurora, something almost hypnotic. Then, I saw it. A faint line of light on the horizon, separate from the aurora. It wasn't the natural glow of the northern lights. It was sharp and steady, unlike anything I'd ever seen before. It stretched into the distance, like a road carved into the snow, faintly glowing green and purple. My curiosity got the better of me, and I started walking toward it. The snow crunched under my boots as I moved across the frozen landscape. The line of light was farther than I thought, but it didn't fade. It stayed clear and sharp, as if it were waiting for me to reach it. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being led somewhere. When I finally reached it, I realized it wasn't just a line of light. It was a path, perfectly straight and smooth, cutting through the snow. The edges shimmered faintly, reflecting the colors of the aurora above. It was too perfect to be natural, and yet it felt ancient, as if it had always been there, hidden beneath the snow. I hesitated. Every instinct told me to turn back, to leave the path alone. But the lights above seemed to pulse again, their colors intensifying, and I felt a strange pull. It was like the aurora wanted me to follow. So I did. The path was smooth underfoot, almost too smooth, like walking on polished glass. The air grew colder as I walked, the wind whispering softly around me. The snow on either side of the path seemed untouched, pristine, as if no one had ever set foot there before. My breath clouded in. Front of me, the only sound in the eerie silence. As I walked, the aurora above seemed to shift, its movements slower now, almost deliberate. The lights formed strange shapes, swirling and twisting in patterns that didn't feel random. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like they were watching me, guiding me. The path stretched endlessly, and I had no idea how far I had gone. Time felt strange, the minutes blending into hours. The further I walked, the more the world around me changed. The snow seemed darker, the air heavier, and the silence deeper. The wind stopped, leaving the world unnaturally still. Then I saw something ahead, a structure, faint and shadowy in the distance, rising out of the snow. My heart raced as I moved closer, my boots echoing on the smooth path. The structure was massive, made of dark stone, its surface glinting faintly with frost. It looked like a doorway, tall and imposing, with strange symbols etched into its surface. The symbols pulsed faintly, glowing the same colors as the aurora above. I stopped in front of it, my breath catching in my throat. The doorway was open, revealing only darkness beyond. The glow from the symbols cast faint light into the void, but it didn't show what lay inside. I felt a cold dread creeping into my chest, but I couldn't turn away. The aurora pulsed again, brighter this time, and the pull became stronger. I stepped closer, my hands trembling. As I crossed the threshold, the cold air grew sharp, biting into my skin. The light from the doorway flickered, casting strange shadows that danced across the dark walls. The silence was deafening, the air thick with an unnatural weight. Then I heard it. A sound, faint and distant, like a whisper carried on the wind. It wasn't the wind, though. Sound was too deliberate, too human. It grew louder as I walked deeper into the darkness, the whispers overlapping, turning into a low, guttural hum. My flashlight flickered, the beam weak and unsteady, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement. Something shifted in the shadows, quick and fleeting, just at the edge of the light. My heart pounded as I turned in circles, shining the flashlight in every direction. The hum grew louder, and I realized it wasn't random. It was voices, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all speaking at once, their words incomprehensible. The sound filled the space around me, vibrating through my chest, making it hard to breathe. Then, the darkness moved. It wasn't just shadows. It was something alive, something vast and shapeless, swirling like smoke. Eyes blinked open within the void, dozens of them, glowing faintly with the same colors as the aurora. They stared at me, unblinking, their gazes heavy and piercing. I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The eyes followed me, their glow growing brighter, illuminating the darkness. The voices grew louder, overlapping, until they were a deafening roar. My knees buckled, and I fell to the cold, hard ground. Then, not in words I could understand, but in a voice that pierced through my mind, filling my thoughts with images I couldn't comprehend. Vast, alien landscapes, endless darkness, a sense of something ancient and hungry, waiting just beyond the edges of the world. I screamed, scrambling to my feet, and turned to run. The path I had followed was still there, glowing faintly, leading back to the endless snow. I ran as fast as I could, the voices chasing me, the eyes burning into my back. When I finally stumbled out onto the open snow, the doorway vanished behind me. The aurora above pulsed one last time before fading, the colors bleeding into the night sky. The world was silent again, the air heavy with a sense of something watching. I don't know how I made it back to the cabin. My legs felt like lead, my mind a jumbled mess of fear and confusion. The aurora hasn't appeared since that night, but I still see it sometimes in my dreams, in the corners of my vision. I still hear the whispers, faint and distant, calling me back to the path, and I know, deep down, that if I follow them again, I won't return. The frozen lake stretched out before me, silent and still, a sheet of ice so clear it reflected the pale gray sky above. The air was bitterly cold, the cold that sinks deep into your bones no matter how many layers you wear. My boots crunched softly in the snow as I approached the edge, my breath forming small clouds that hung in the air before vanishing. I had come to the lake for solitude, a quiet escape from the noise of the world. There was something peaceful about the emptiness of winter, the way the snow muffled every sound. But today, the silence felt different, heavier, like the world was holding its breath. I stepped onto the ice cautiously, testing its strength. It was solid, thick enough to hold my weight without so much as a creak. The surface was smooth and glassy, clearer than I expected, allowing me to see the dark depths below. It was strange, almost mesmerizing, the way the light seemed to dance across the ice. I walked slowly, my eyes fixed on the ground, marveling at the clarity. I could see cracks, running through the ice like veins, tiny bubbles frozen mid-movement, and shadows flickering deep beneath the surface. My reflection stared back at me as I moved, distorted slightly by the uneven surface. Then I stopped. There was something in the icy face. At first, I thought it was just my reflection, warped and twisted by the imperfections in the surface. But as I crouched down for a closer look, my stomach dropped. The face was mine, but it wasn't a reflection. It was clearer, sharper. It was trapped beneath the ice, staring up at me, and it was smiling. My own face, but with a smile that didn't belong to me. It was too wide, too sharp, the corners of the mouth stretching unnaturally. The eyes were hollow, dark pits that seemed to see straight through me. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. My heart raced as I stared down and at the face, hoping it would disappear. It didn't. The smile seemed to grow wider as I stood there, frozen in place. My mind raced with explanations. A trick of the light? A shadow? My imagination? But it didn't look like an illusion. It was too real. The wind picked up, howling across the lake, and I shivered. I told myself to leave, to go back to the shore, and forget about the face in the ice. But something held me there, some strange pull that I couldn't explain. I crouched down again, my fingers brushing the frozen surface. The ice was cold, so cold it burned, but I couldn't look away. The face stared back at me, its grin unchanging. Then, as I watched, it moved. The smile twisted, the edges curling upward even further, and the hollow eyes blinked. My stomach turned, and I scrambled back, nearly slipping on the slick surface. The face didn't vanish. It followed me, its features shifting slightly as I moved. It wasn't trapped beneath the ice. It was watching me. Panic set in, and I turned to run. My boots slid on the ice, and I nearly fell, but I didn't stop. Shore felt impossibly far, the cold air cutting into my lungs with every... I didn't dare look down. I didn't want to see if the face was still there. The ice beneath me groaned, a low, ominous sound that echoed across the lake. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound grew louder, and I realized it wasn't just the ice. It was a voice, faint and distant, calling my name. I turned my head slowly, fear twisting in my gut. The face was still there, but it wasn't smiling anymore. Its mouth was open, lips curled back to reveal jagged teeth. The hollow eyes seemed deeper, darker, as if they held something terrible within them. The voice came again, louder this time. My name, repeated over and over, each time more insistent. It wasn't coming from the face. It was coming from the ice itself, from deep below the surface. The sound surrounded me, muffled and distorted, as if the lake itself was alive. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran, the ice groaning beneath my feet, the sound of the voice chasing me. The shore was so close now, just a few more steps, but as I reached the edge, I felt the air grow colder, heavier, like a hand pressing down on me. I glanced back one last time, and what I saw will haunt me forever. The face wasn't alone anymore. Dozens of them stared up at me from the ice, each one twisted into a grotesque grin. their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. They moved in unison, their mouths opening and closing as they whispered my name. I stumbled onto the shore, falling to my knees in the snow. I heaved as I gasped for air, my mind reeling from what I had just seen. The whispers faded, replaced by an eerie silence. When I looked back at the lake, the faces were gone. The ice was smooth and empty, as if nothing had ever been there. I don't go near frozen lakes anymore. I can't. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear the faint sound of my name, carried on the wind, and when I close my eyes, I see the face in the ice, smiling that terrible, unnatural smile, and I know it's still watching, waiting.